The town of Purgatory Creek sat on the lip of the Badlands like a scab on a healing wound. It was not a place where people came to live. It was a place where people ended up when the wagon wheels broke or the money ran out. To the west, the high plains stretched out in a flat, shimmering sheet of heat, broken only by the skeletal fingers of sagebrush and the occasional twisted mesquite. To the east, the earth fell away into jagged ravines of red rock and shale, a chaotic jumble of stone that looked as if God had struck the earth with a hammer in a moment of terrible anger. The wind was the only constant resident. It did not blow so much as it scoured. It carried a fine grit that settled into the creases of clothing, the lines of faces, and the taste of the water. In summer, the sun turned the valley into a kiln, baking the moisture out of the soil until the ground cracked open like a parched lip. In winter, the mercury dropped until birds froze on the branch, and the cattle that had not been moved to the lower draws would be found stiff and dusted with frost in the morning light. It was a hard country for men, and harder still for women. Yet Clara Walsh remained. Clara stood by the well at the center of the Walsh homestead, her boots planted firmly in the dust. She was 22 years old, though the sun and the wind had already begun to etch fine lines at the corners of her eyes. She wore a faded calico dress that had been mended so many times the original pattern was lost beneath patches of gray and brown. Her hands, gripping the rough hemp rope of the well bucket, were not the soft hands of a town girl. They were calloused, the knuckles swollen slightly from work, the fingernails cut short and rimmed with the dark soil of the garden she fought to keep alive. She heaved on the rope, the pulley squealing in protest. The sound was a screech that cut through the silence of the afternoon. Hand over hand, she hauled the water up from the dark belly of the earth. When the bucket finally cleared the rim, sloshing half its contents back into the depths, Clara paused to wipe the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. The water was brown and smelled faintly of sulfur, but it was wet. And in this country, that was enough. She poured it into the trough for the two plow horses that stood with their heads low, tails flicking lethargically at flies. Clara leaned against the fence post, looking out toward the northern pasture. It was a sea of brittle yellow grass that crunched underfoot. She narrowed her eyes against the glare. It was September, and the heat should have broken by now. But the summer was clinging on with the desperation of a dying man. Her gaze drifted to the small rise behind the house, where a single wooden cross stood stark against the sky. Her mother lay there. Clara remembered the winter she died. It had been 5 years ago. A fever had swept through the valley just as a blizzard rolled down from the Rockies. The snow had piled up to the windows, trapping them inside with the sickness. Clara remembered the sound of the wind howling down the chimney, drowning out her mother's labored breathing. She remembered the cold that seeped through the chinking in the logs, and the terrible heat of her mother's skin. They had buried her when the ground thawed, wrapping her in her best quilt. Thomas Walsh had not cried then. He had simply gone out to the barn and sharpened his axe until the metal screamed, and he had not stopped working since. Loneliness was a physical weight in Clara's chest. It was not just the absence of people, it was the absence of hope. Most of the other small families had packed up and left, driven out by the drought or the pressure from the big outfits. Now, it was just Clara and Thomas, holding onto a patch of dirt that seemed determined to shake them off. Inside the small ranch house, the air was still and thick with the smell of stale coffee. Thomas Walsh sat at the rough-hewn table, staring into a tin cup. He was a man whittled down by time and labor. His shoulders, once broad enough to carry a calf, were stooped now. A chronic cough lived in his chest, rattling like dry leaves every time he took a deep breath. He had a limp in his left leg, a souvenir from a horse that had rolled on him 10 years prior. Clara entered, the screen door slamming behind her. She moved to the stove and picked up the coffee pot. "Your cup is empty," she said softly. Thomas looked up, startled, as if he had been miles away. He forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It is fine. Clara, just thinking." "You are thinking about the fence in the north quarter," Clara said, pouring him the last of the thick, black liquid It needs wire. We do not have wire. Thomas took the cup, his hand trembling slightly. He wrapped his fingers around the warmth. We will make do. We always make do. I can splice the old wire from the corral. It will not hold. Thomas, if the stock pushes against it, they will be halfway to the river before we know they are gone. Thomas slammed the cup down, sloshing coffee onto the table. It will hold because it has to hold. I am not letting this place fall down around our ears. Girl, your mother lies on that hill. I promised her. Clara sighed, her frustration melting into a familiar ache. She walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. He felt frail beneath his flannel shirt, like a bird with hollow bones. I know, Papa, I know. Drink your coffee. I will go see if I can twist some of the baling wire to fix the gap. She stepped back out into the blinding light, leaving him alone with his pride and his ghosts. 3 miles away, a rider crested the ridge overlooking the town. Eli Cade sat atop a big bay gelding that looked as road-weary as he felt. Eli was a man of 30 years, though his eyes looked older. A scar, white and jagged, ran along the line of his jaw on the left side, disappearing into the stubble of a 3-day beard. His hat was pulled low, the brim stained with sweat and rain. He wore a canvas duster that had once been tan but was now the color of the road, and a gun belt hung at his hip, the leather worn smooth where his hand would rest. He did not look at the view with appreciation. He scanned it for threats. That was a habit he could not break, born of years riding in places where a man on the skyline was a target. He nudged the horse forward, descending the rocky trail toward the cluster of buildings that made up the town. The main street was a wide strip of beaten earth, rutted by wagon wheels and littered with horse manure. The buildings were false-fronted wooden structures, their paint peeled away by the wind, leaving gray wood that looked like old bone. Eli rode past the livery and the general store, his eyes moving constantly. He saw a woman hurriedly pull a child inside a doorway as he passed. He saw a curtain twitch in a window. He was a stranger, and in a town this size, a stranger meant trouble. He pulled up in front of the saloon, a building that leaned slightly to the left, as if tired of standing. He tied the bay to the hitching rail and loosened the cinch to let the animal breathe. He patted the horse's neck, a rare gesture of softness, before stepping onto the boardwalk. The saloon smelled of sawdust, tobacco smoke, and unwashed bodies. It was dim inside, a relief from the glaring sun. Eli moved to the bar, his spurs chiming softly on the floorboards. He kept his back to the wall, finding a spot where he could see the door and the room at the same time. The barkeep was a heavy man with a mustache that hid his mouth and an apron stained with grease. He looked Eli up and down, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second on the pistol at Eli's hip. He knew the look. It was the look of a man who slept light and woke up fast. Whiskey, Eli said. His voice was gravel, unused to long conversations. The barkeep poured a glass of amber liquid from a bottle with no label. 2 bits. Eli placed 2 coins on the counter. He did not drink immediately. He watched the room. In the back corner, a group of 5 men sat around a poker table. They were loud, their laughter sharp and jagged. They wore long dusters and high-crowned hats, and they carried themselves with the arrogance of men who knew they could do as they pleased. They were not working cowboys. They were hired guns, or close enough to it. One of them, a man with a red face and a gap between his front teeth, was leaning back in his chair, shouting at a small, frightened-looking man sweeping the floor. "Hey, Pedro, you missed a spot over here. Come lick it up." The other men roared with laughter. The sweeper, a Mexican man with gray hair, kept his head down and moved his broom to the other side of the room. The red-faced man stood up and walked over, kicking the broom out of the sweeper's hand. I said, "Come here, boy. Are you deaf?" Eli's hand tightened around his glass. The glass was thick, but he felt as if he could crush it. He watched the Mexican man stoop to pick up the broom, murmuring an apology. The red-faced man shoved him with a boot, sending him sprawling into the sawdust. "Look at that. Clumsy. Just like those dirt scratchers out on the flats. trying to pretend they belong here. One of the men at the table shouted, "Leave him be, Jack. We got better things to do than kick dogs." "We got to go check on the Walsh place later. Boss says it is time to squeeze a little harder." The men laughed again. "Rid the valley of the rats," the red-faced man said, spitting on the floor near the sweeper's head. Then he turned and swaggered back to the table. Eli lifted the glass and downed the whiskey in one swallow. It burned all the way down. He signaled the barkeep. "Who are they?" Eli asked, his voice low. The barkeep wiped a rag across the wood. "That is Silas Crow's outfit. Crow runs the big spread north of here. Runs the town, too, mostly. And the Walsh place?" The barkeep sighed. "Thomas Walsh. Old fool. Got a piece of land that blocks Crow's access to the Sweetwater Creek. Crow has been trying to buy him out for 2 years. Walsh will not sell. Why not? Stubbornness. Says his wife is buried there." The barkeep leaned in closer. "Look, stranger, if you are looking for work, do not look at Walsh. He cannot pay, and working for him puts a target on your back. Crow does not like resistance." Eli looked at the men in the corner. They were laughing again, passing a bottle between them. He looked at the Mexican man, who was quietly brushing the dust from his trousers. "Is Walsh hiring?" Eli asked. The barkeep frowned. "I heard he is looking for a hand to break some horses and fix fence, but like I said, it is a losing bet. Crow will burn him out eventually. Folks here know it. That is why nobody lifts a finger. Better to let the old man die than get caught in the fire." Eli placed the glass down on the bar. He looked at his reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. He saw the scar, the dust, the tiredness. He had spent 10 years running from trouble, and 10 years finding it anyway. "Where's the ranch?" Eli asked. The barkeep shook his head, judging Eli to be a fool. 5 miles south. Follow the dry creek bed until you see a house that looks like a strong wind would knock it over. That is the Walsh place." Eli tipped his hat. "Much obliged." He walked out into the sun, the sound of the men's laughter following him like a curse. The ride to the Walsh ranch was a journey through desolation. The land was cracked into a mosaic of dry mud. The sagebrush was gray and brittle, snapping if a horse brushed against it. To the west, great towers of dark clouds were building up, purple and bruised-looking. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that vibrated in the chest. But the air remained dry. It was a dry storm, the kind that brought lightning and wind but no rain, the kind that started fires. Eli saw the ranch house from a mile away. The barkeep had been cruel but accurate. The house was small, built of weathered timber that had turned silver in the sun. A leaning barn stood nearby, and a corral made of mismatched poles held a few horses. As he rode closer, he saw a figure in the corral. It was a woman, slight of build, trying to hold onto a rope attached to a yearling colt. The colt was a wild thing, all legs and panic. It reared up, striking out with its front hooves. The woman was dragged forward, her boots skidding in the dirt, but she did not let go. Eli watched for a moment. Most women would have let go. Most men would have let go. She dug her heels in, shouting at the animal, her voice lost in the wind. The colt bucked, twisting its body, and the woman was thrown sideways, hitting the rail of the corral hard. She scrambled up instantly. Grabbing the rope again before the colt could bolt, Eli spurred the bay into a trot. He reached the corral, swung down from the saddle, and vaulted over the fence in one fluid motion. "Let me take him," Eli said. Clara spun around, startled. Her face was streaked with dust, and a bruise was already forming on her cheekbone. Her eyes flashed with anger. "I have got it," she snapped. "You are going to get your arm pulled out of the socket," Eli said calmly. He did not wait for permission. He stepped in, moving with a slow, deliberate confidence. He did not grab the rope from her. He moved up the line, his hand closing over the hemp. He made a low, clicking sound in his throat. The colt rolled its eyes, nostrils flaring, and jerked its head. Eli did not pull back. He held the tension, not fighting the horse, just acting as an anchor. He spoke to it. A steady stream of nonsense words, his voice low and rhythmic. "Easy now. Easy. Son, nobody's hurting you." The colt trembled, its skin twitching, but it stopped bucking. It watched Eli with wide, fearful eyes. Eli moved closer, inch by inch, until he could reach out and touch the animal's neck. He stroked the sweat-damp hide, his movement slow. Clara watched him, her chest heaving. She wiped her hands on her dress. She wanted to be angry at this stranger for interfering, but she could not deny the skill in his hands. He handled the horse as if he were speaking a language she did not know. After a minute, the colt let out a long breath and lowered its head. Eli patted its neck one last time and tied the rope to the snubbing post. He turned to Clara. "He's got a soft mouth. You were pulling too hard on the left." Clara straightened her back, trying to regain her dignity. "He is stubborn, like everything else on this ranch." She looked him over, taking in the gun, the scar, the dust. "Who are you?" "Name is Eli Cade. Heard in town your father was looking for a hand." Clara's guard went up instantly. "We cannot pay much. I did not ask for much. We have a room in the barn. Food is simple. The work is hard." Eli looked around at the dry fields, the broken fences, the loneliness of the place. "I'm not afraid of work, ma'am." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. She saw the shadows in his eyes, the kind that came from seeing things a man shouldn't see. But she also saw that he had not looked at her with the hungry, disrespectful eyes of the men in town. He looked at her like she was a person. "Papa is inside," she said, gesturing toward the house. "You can talk to him." Supper that night was a quiet affair. The kitchen was small, lit by a single kerosene lamp that threw long shadows against the walls. They ate stew that was mostly broth and potatoes, with a few scraps of tough beef. Thomas Walsh sat at the head of the table. He had interrogated Eli for 20 minutes before hiring him, asking about his experience with cattle, with horses, with branding. He had not asked about Eli's past, and Eli had not offered it. "I can give you $10 a month and your keep," Thomas said, wiping his plate with a piece of stale bread. "It is not a fortune. It is enough," Eli said. Clara sat across from him. She ate silently, her eyes downcast, but Eli noticed her hands. She touched the table gently, tracing the grain of the wood. It was a loving touch, as if the table itself were a part of her family. Eli looked around the room. It was poor, but it was clean. A small wooden cross hung on the wall above the stove. Next to it was a charcoal drawing of a woman, Clara's mother. She had the same eyes as Clara, wide and intelligent. There was a peace here that Eli had not felt in years. It was fragile, held together by the stubborn will of an old man and a young woman. But it was real. For a man who had spent his life sleeping in bedrolls under the open sky or in cheap boarding houses, the small kitchen felt almost sacred. "So, Mr. Cade," Thomas said, coughing into his fist, "what brings a man like you to a dying town like this, just drifting?" Eli said, "Looking for a place where the wind does not blow so hard." Thomas laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Then you rode into the wrong valley. Son, the wind here does not stop until it has stripped the flesh from your bones." "I reckon I will find out," Eli said. The days turned into a week, then 2. The work was brutal. Eli rose before the sun, the air cold and sharp, and worked until the light failed. He and Clara spent the days riding the fence line. The Walsh land was larger than it looked, stretching back into the canyons where the grass was a little greener. They found breaks in the wire almost every day, cuts that looked clean, made by wire cutters, not by cattle. Eli fixed them without comment, twisting the wire with his gloved hands, stretching it tight until it sang. Clara worked beside him. She was strong, stronger than any woman he had ever known. She could lift a spool of wire, drive a staple into a cedar post, and ride all day without complaint. The heat was relentless. The sun hammered down on their backs. They rode past creek beds that were nothing but cracked mud and stones. They saw the bleached white bones of cows that had died the winter before, ribs curving up from the earth like the hull of a wrecked ship. Sometimes, storm clouds would gather in the afternoon, teasing them with the promise of rain. The sky would turn a dark, angry purple, and the wind would whip the sagebrush into a frenzy. But the rain never fell. The clouds would drift apart, leaving the land dry and aching. Clara slowly began to warm to him. It was in the small things. She stopped stiffening when he walked into a room. She began to pour his coffee first in the mornings. One afternoon, in the barn, they were sorting tools. Eli reached for a hammer at the same time Clara did. His hand brushed hers. Her skin was rough, hot from the work. Clara pulled her hand back quickly, but she did not look away. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. There was a speck of gold in the brown of her irises that he had not noticed before. "Sorry," Eli mumbled, stepping back. "It is fine," Clara said. Her voice was breathy. There was a current between them, silent and invisible, like the charge in the air before a lightning strike. It was born of shared labor, of sweating together in the sun, of being the only two young people in a world of old men and dying land. Eli felt it in his chest, a strange mixture of hope and fear. He knew he had no business looking at her that way. He was a drifter with blood on his hands. She was a decent woman trying to save her home. Trouble arrived on a Tuesday, riding 5 horses. Eli was in the corral, shoeing the bay. When he heard the hoofbeats, he dropped the horse's hoof and stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. He checked the pistol at his hip instinctively. 5 riders came up the lane, dust swirling around them in a choking cloud. At the front rode a man Eli recognized from descriptions, though he had never seen him. Silas Crow. Crow was a big man, heavy in the gut but solid. He wore a fine black suit that was coated in gray dust, and a white hat that cost more than Eli made in a year. His face was broad, his nose broken and healed crooked, his eyes small and dark like beads of obsidian. Behind him rode 4 men. Eli recognized the red-faced man from the saloon. Thomas came out of the house, limping heavily. Clara followed him, drying her hands on an apron. She stood close to her father, her chin high, but Eli saw the tremor in her hands. Eli walked over and stood 10 feet away, saying nothing. He kept his hands loose at his sides. Crow pulled his horse up. He did not dismount. He looked down at Thomas like a king looking at a peasant. "Afternoon." "Thomas," Crow said. His voice was deep and smooth, like oil. "Silas." Thomas said. "He did not invite him down." "I was riding the perimeter," Crow said, looking around the dilapidated ranch yard with a sneer. "Thought I would stop by, make you that offer one last time." Thomas straightened his stooped shoulders. "I told you, Silas, the answer is no." Crow sighed, as if dealing with a petulant child. "Be reasonable. Thomas, look at this place. It is falling down. The drought is killing your stock. I am offering you a fair price, more than fair. You could take that girl of yours and move east, buy a little house in St. Louis. Live out your days in comfort. This land is my home," Thomas said. "My wife is buried on that hill. I am not selling her grave to you so you can run more cattle." Crow's pleasant expression vanished. The coldness that replaced it was terrifying. It was the face of a man who was used to crushing things. "Graves can be moved, Thomas, or they can be forgotten. Is that a threat?" Thomas asked. Crow ignored him. He turned his eyes to Clara. He looked her up and down, his gaze slow and insulting. It lingered on her chest, her hips. The men behind him chuckled, a low, dirty sound. A pretty thing like her. Crow said, "It is a shame to keep her out here in the dust. She will be an old maid before she is 25, or maybe she will find herself alone out here. It is dangerous country for a woman alone." Eli took a step forward. His boots crunched loudly in the gravel. Crow's eyes snapped to Eli. "Who is this? Another stray you picked up? Thomas, he is my hand," Thomas said. Crow laughed. "A hand? For 10 head of cattle? You are wasting your money." "Thomas." Crow leaned forward over his saddle horn. "Listen to me. Old man, the law in this valley rides with the herd that pays its feed. You understand? There are no marshals coming to save you. There is just me, and I am tired of asking. We are not selling," Clara said. Her voice was shaking, but it was loud. Crow smiled at her, a smile that made Eli's skin crawl. "We will see, darling, we will see." Crow yanked his horse's head around. "Let us go, boys. The smell of poverty is making me sick." As they rode off, the red-faced man looked back at Clara and shouted, "Do not worry, sweetheart. We will be back to keep you company soon enough." The riders disappeared into the dust. That evening, the silence on the ranch was heavy. The air felt charged, waiting for the thunder that rumbled in the distance. Thomas had gone to bed early, exhausted by the confrontation. Eli and Clara were in the barn, checking the horses for the night. "We cannot stay here," Clara said suddenly. She was brushing the mare, her strokes hard and angry. Eli leaned against a stall door. "Your father will not leave. Then he will die here." Clara spun around, tears in her eyes. "Did you see them? Eli, did you see how they looked at us? They are going to kill him. And they are going to—" She stopped, unable to say the words. Eli looked at her. He wanted to tell her it would be all right, but he was not a liar. "Maybe we should go," Clara whispered. "Just pack the wagon tonight and go, before they come back." Eli looked at the ground. He thought about the road, the endless miles of nothing, the hunger, the cold. "Sometimes running does not work. Clara," he said softly, "I have been running a long time. The trouble, it has a way of following you. If you leave this land, they win, and you have nothing. A man or a woman is nothing without a place to stand." Clara dropped the brush. "I am scared." "Eli, I know," he said. He wanted to cross the space between them. He wanted to hold her, but he stayed where he was. "I will not let them hurt you," he said. It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but he made it anyway. The barn door creaked open. Thomas stood there, wrapped in a blanket, looking like a ghost in the moonlight. "We are staying," Thomas said. His voice was weak, but hard as iron. "This is our land, Walsh land. If we run now, we are dead anyway." Clara looked at her father, then at Eli. She wiped her eyes. "Okay, Papa, we stay." Thomas nodded and went back to the house. Clara looked at Eli one last time, a look of desperate trust, and followed her father. Eli did not go to his room. He walked out to the porch of the ranch house and sat on the steps. He took his gun out of the holster and checked the cylinder. 6 rounds. He looked out at the dark valley. The wind was picking up, howling through the eaves of the house. The storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones. It wasn't just the rain and the thunder. It was something darker. Crow was coming back. And when he did, there would be fire. Eli spun the cylinder, the metal clicking softly in the night. He holstered the gun and stared into the blackness, waiting. The following days did not bring the storm the clouds promised, but they brought a heaviness that settled over the Walsh ranch like a wet wool blanket. The air grew still and hot, the kind of heat that pressed against the temples and made the eyes ache. It was a silence that felt occupied, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting for a blow to land. The sabotage began with small cruelties. On Wednesday morning, Eli rode out to the western perimeter to find 300 yards of fence line lying flat in the dust. The wire had not snapped from tension. It had been cut, the ends bright and silver where the metal shears had bitten through. The cattle that had been grazing there were gone, scattered into the deep ravines where the scrub oak grew thick and tangled. Eli spent the day tracking them, the sun hammering against his shoulders. He found most of them, spooked and skittish, but 2 yearlings were missing entirely. He found their tracks leading north, driven by shod horses. It was a theft, plain and simple, but done with enough carelessness to serve as an insult. They did not just want the cattle. They wanted Thomas Walsh to know they could take them whenever they pleased. On Thursday, Clara went to the well to draw water for the washing. Eli was in the barn, mending a bridle, when he heard the bucket clatter against the stones, followed by a sound of disgust that was almost a retch. He ran to her, his hand instinctively going to his hip. Clara was standing back from the well, her face pale, her hand covering her mouth. The smell hit Eli before he reached the rim, the sweet, cloying stench of rot. He looked down into the darkness. Floating in the water, bloated and obscene, were the carcasses of 3 jackrabbits. Their bodies were swollen, their fur matting in the stagnant water. They had not fallen in by accident. The well cover had been heavy oak, and it was lying in the dirt 5 feet away. Someone had removed it, thrown the vermin in, and left the cover off to ensure the poison took hold. "Do not drink it," Eli said, his voice flat. He gripped the edge of the stone wall, his knuckles white. "We will have to drain it, scrub it. It will take days before it is safe again." Clara stared at the dead animals, her eyes filling with tears of frustration. "They are trying to make us leave," she whispered. "They are trying to thirst us out." Eli looked up at the horizon. High above, black vultures circled in slow, lazy spirals, riding the thermals. They were patient birds. They knew that in this country. Death was usually just a matter of time. On the distant ridge, barely visible against the glare of the sky, Eli saw the silhouette of a rider. The figure sat motionless for a long moment, watching them. Before turning his horse and disappearing behind the crest, the land felt stalked. Every rustle of the sagebrush sounded like a footstep. Every shift of the wind sounded like a whisper. The dust devils that rose from the flats did not just wander. They seemed to march, twisting in tight spirals as if the ground itself was uneasy, churning with a fever it could not sweat out. By Friday, Thomas Walsh had had enough. He came out of his bedroom wearing his Sunday coat. It was black wool, shiny at the elbows and too warm for the weather, but he buttoned it all the way to his chin. He had combed his gray hair back with water and polished his boots. He looked like a man going to church, or to war. "I am going to town," Thomas announced. He stood in the kitchen, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a rage that had been simmering in his chest for years. "Papa." "No," Clara said, looking up from the basin where she was trying to wash the smell of death off her hands. "You know what they will do." "I know what I will do," Thomas said. "I will speak to the marshal. I am a citizen. I pay my taxes. I have a deed to this land that is signed and stamped. I will not have my well poisoned and my fences cut by a gang of hired thugs, while the law sits in his office and polices his fingernails." "I will ride with you," Eli said. He grabbed his hat from the peg by the door. "No," Thomas said sharply. Eli froze. Thomas turned to him, his eyes hard. "You will stay here, Mr. Cade." "Thomas, it is not safe," Eli argued, his voice low. "Crow's men are looking for a fight. If you go alone, you are giving them one. And if you come with me, you are giving them a war." Thomas countered. "If I bring a gunman, they will say I came looking for trouble. They will say I escalated it. I am going as a landowner to speak to the law. I am going peacefully." Eli stepped closer, towering over the older man. Peace does not mean much to men like Silas Crow. Thomas gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. His limp was bad today. The damp pressure in the air made his leg ache. "I need you here, Eli. I need you to guard the ranch. If they see me ride out, they might circle back and come here. Clara is alone. I will not leave her alone." Eli looked at Clara. She was watching him, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded slowly. "Do as he says. Eli, please." Eli felt a knot coil in his gut, a cold snake of intuition that told him this was a mistake. He knew how men like Crow operated. They did not respect the law. They used it like a tool, same as a branding iron or a whip. But he was a hired hand, and Thomas was the boss. And more than that, the thought of leaving Clara undefended, even for an hour, made his blood run cold. "All right," Eli said, though the word tasted like ash. "I will stay, but you keep your head down. Thomas, you say your piece and you ride back. Do not let them bait you." Thomas adjusted his hat. "I am not a fool. Son, I just want what is mine." He walked out to the yard, mounting his horse with a grunt of effort. He did not look back as he rode down the lane, his back straight. A solitary figure moving against the vast, empty backdrop of the plains. The afternoon stretched out, agonizingly slow. The dark clouds that had hovered over the mountains for days began to slide closer, blotting out the sun. The light turned a strange, bruised yellow. The wind picked up, whipping the brittle grass into a frenzy, but there was no smell of rain in it. It was a dry wind, hot and rough, carrying the scent of ozone and dust. Eli paced the length of the porch. He checked the load in his Winchester rifle and leaned it against the door frame. He checked his pistol. He scanned the horizon until his eyes watered from the strain. Clara came out and sat on the steps, wrapping her arms around her knees. She looked small against the darkening sky. "He should be there by now," she said. "He will be fine." Eli lied. He sat down on the railing, watching her. Clara was silent for a long time. She watched a tumbleweed bounce across the yard and catch on the fence. "Eli," she said softly. "Yeah? Why did you come here?" "Really?" Eli looked away, staring at the scar on the back of his hand. "I told you, looking for work." "You looked for work in a place where there is no work," Clara said. "You handle a gun better than you handle a hammer, though you are good with both. And you have eyes that never stop moving." She turned to look at him. Her gaze was direct, stripped of any pretense. "Who were you before you were a cowboy on a failing ranch?" Eli took a breath. The wind rattled the loose boards of the porch roof. He felt the weight of his past pressing on him, heavy as a stone. "I rode with a bad outfit," he said. His voice was rough, barely louder than the wind. "Down in the New Mexico territory." Clara did not flinch. She just waited. "I was young," Eli continued, angry. "I thought the world owed me something because I had nothing. The man who led us, he talked about freedom, about taking back what the rich men stole. It sounded good when you were hungry and sleeping in the dirt." He rubbed his jaw, feeling the ridge of the scar there. "But it wasn't freedom. It was just meanness. We took from folks who had barely more than we did. We scared people, hurt people." Clara watched him, her expression unreadable. "Why did you leave?" Eli closed his eyes for a second. "We hit a homestead near the border. It was supposed to be a supply run. But the boys, they got carried away. There was a family." He stopped. He could not tell her the details. He could not put those pictures in her head. "Things happened that I could not live with," he said simply. "I tried to stop it. That is where I got this." He touched his jaw. "I put a bullet in the leader's shoulder and I rode out. I have been riding ever since, trying to find a place where I could sleep without seeing their faces." He looked at her then, expecting to see disgust. He expected her to tell him to get off her land. Instead, Clara looked at him with a profound sadness. "You are not that man anymore," she said. Eli shook his head. "I do not know. Sometimes I feel like he is still right there, waiting. That is why I do not like gunfights. Clara, it is not that I am afraid of getting killed. I am afraid of what comes out of me when the shooting starts." Clara reached out and placed her hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but it burned through his shirt. "You are here now," she said. "You are helping us. That is what matters." Eli looked at her hand, then up at her face. In the strange yellow light of the storm, she looked beautiful and fierce. He wanted to tell her that she was the first thing in 10 years that made him want to stay in one place. Before he could speak, the sound of galloping hooves cut through the wind. Eli was on his feet in an instant, the rifle in his hands. A rider was coming up the lane, leaning low over the neck of his horse. The horse was lathered in white sweat, its eyes rolling. It was a boy from town, the son of the blacksmith. He pulled the horse up so hard it slid on its haunches, kicking up a spray of gravel. "Mr. Cade!" the boy shouted, gasping for breath. "Mr. Cade, you have to come!" "What is it?" Eli demanded, stepping off the porch. "It is Mr. Walsh." The boy's face was pale, streaked with dust and tears. "Crow's men, they have got him in the street. They are saying he stole cattle. The marshal won't do anything. They have got guns on him." Dread, cold and sharp, slammed into Eli's stomach. He did not ask for details. He knew. "Stay here," Eli ordered Clara. Do not move from this house." "I am coming," Clara cried, jumping to her feet. "No!" Eli roared. He had never raised his voice at her before, and it stopped her cold. "You stay here. If they come here, you bar the door. Do you understand?" He did not wait for an answer. He ran to the barn, grabbing the bay's bridle. He didn't bother with a saddle. He vaulted onto the horse's bare back, gripping the mane. He kicked the horse into a gallop, tearing out of the yard. The wind howled in his ears, sounding like a chorus of screaming voices. The ride to town was a blur of sagebrush and gray earth. The landscape felt hostile, fighting him. The wind pushed against his chest. The dust whipped his face, stinging his eyes. The trail was a narrow rut between low bluffs, and every shadow looked like an ambush. Eli rode with a desperation that bordered on madness. He pushed the horse harder than he should have, feeling the animal's muscles bunch and strain beneath his legs. "Please," he thought, a prayer to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. "Please let me be in time." In the town of Purgatory Creek, the main street was a theater of cruelty. Thomas Walsh was on his knees in the dirt. His Sunday coat was torn at the shoulder, and his hat lay in a pile of horse manure a few feet away. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, running into his eye. Surrounding him were 7 of Crow's men. They formed a loose circle, like wolves circling a wounded elk. They were relaxed, smiling. This was not a fight. It was sport. Silas Crow sat on his horse a few yards away, watching with a detached amusement. He was smoking a cigar, the smoke drifting lazily in the wind. "Tell us again, old man," said the red-faced rider, whose name was Jack. "Tell us how Crow is poisoning your water." Thomas tried to stand, but Jack kicked him in the bad leg. Thomas cried out and collapsed back into the dust. The men laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound that echoed off the wooden buildings. I demand to see the marshal," Thomas gasped, clutching his leg. The marshal was standing on the boardwalk outside his office. He was a paunchy man with a face that looked like rising dough. He was sweating, his eyes darting back and forth. He looked at Thomas, then at Crow, and then he looked at his boots. "Maybe you should just listen to them." "Thomas," the marshal called out, his voice weak, "maybe it is time to sell, for Clara's sake." "You coward!" Thomas spat. He managed to push himself up to one knee. "This is my land." Crow's men laughed louder. "Look at him," said another rider. "He thinks he is a king." "King of the dirt pile. We found your brand on 2 of Mr. Crow's steers," Jack said, leaning down. "You are a rustler. Walsh, that is a hanging offense." "Liar!" Thomas shouted. "You planted them. You cut my fence." Jack backhanded him across the face. The sound of the slap was loud in the sudden silence of the wind. Thomas fell backward, spitting blood. Townsfolk were watching from the windows and the doorways. The blacksmith, the grocer, the women in their bonnets. They watched with wide, fearful eyes. They saw a good man being broken, and they did nothing. Fear held them by the throat. To speak was to be next. From the south end of town, Eli Cade came thundering in. He saw the circle. He saw Thomas on the ground. Eli slid the bay to a halt. Dust clouding the air, he leapt off, his rifle in his hand. "Back off!" Eli shouted. The circle of men turned. They did not look afraid. They looked expectant. "Well, look who it is," Jack said, grinning. "The hired help." Eli leveled the rifle at Jack's chest. "Let him up. Now." Crow took the cigar from his mouth. He did not look at Eli. He looked at his lieutenant, a man named Vance, who stood to Thomas's right. Vance had cold eyes and a mustache that drooped over his mouth. "Deal with it," Crow said softly. Vance drew his pistol. It was a smooth, practiced motion. Thomas, seeing the gun, lunged upward, trying to grab Vance's arm. "No!" he shouted. Vance stepped back and fired. The gunshot cracked the air, louder than the thunder. Thomas Walsh jerked backward as if kicked by a mule. The bullet hit him square in the chest. A bloom of red appeared instantly on the white shirt beneath his black coat. He collapsed into the dirt, his face turning toward the sky. For a second, there was silence. Then, the men started laughing. It wasn't a nervous laughter. It was genuine. It was the laughter of men who found violence funny, who found the sudden end of a life absurd. "Look at him flop," one man chuckled. Eli stood frozen. The horror of it slammed into him. He had been 5 seconds too late. Thomas lay on his back, his heels drumming against the ground. He was choking, a terrible wet gurgling sound rising from his throat. Vance walked over and looked down at him. He nudged Thomas's boot with his own. "Sounds like a broken bellow, doesn't he?" Another man leaned in, tilting his head as if listening to music. "That is the sound of stubbornness dying. Boys!" Then a scream tore through the street. It was a sound of pure, jagged agony. "No!" Clara rode into town on the plow horse, her hair flying wild behind her. She had not stayed. She had grabbed the only other horse and followed Eli, unable to sit and wait for the end of her world. She threw herself off the horse before it stopped moving. She ran to the circle of men, pushing past Jack, past Vance. None of them stopped her. They just watched, their grins widening. "Papa!" Clara fell to her knees in the blood-soaked dust. She grabbed Thomas's shoulders, pulling him up into her lap. "Papa, look at me. Please, look at me." Thomas's eyes were glazing over. He struggled to focus. His hand twitched, reaching up. His fingers, stained with his own blood, brushed Clara's cheek, leaving a red smear across her skin. He tried to speak. His lips moved. "Si, Cla." A bubble of blood burst on his lips. He took one last, rattling breath, his chest heaving, and then he went still. The light faded from his eyes, leaving them staring blankly at the indifferent gray sky. Clara screamed again, a long, wailing note of grief that should have shattered the windows. She rocked back and forth, clutching his dead body against her chest, sobbing into his bloody coat. Crow watched, his expression unchanged. He signaled to his men. "Let us go. The air is getting stale." Eli stood 10 feet away. The rage in him was a white-hot fire. His hands were shaking so hard the rifle barrel vibrated. He looked at Vance. He looked at Crow. He had a clear shot at both of them. He could kill them. He knew he could. He could drop Vance, swing the lever, and take Crow out of the saddle before they cleared leather. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, he saw the other men. There were 6 of them left. They all had their hands on their guns. They were watching him, waiting for him to make a move. If he fired, they would open up. The street would turn into a slaughterhouse. And Clara was right in the middle of it. She was cradling her father, oblivious to the guns. If a firefight started, she would be cut down in the crossfire. Crow saw Eli's hesitation. He smiled. "Smart boy." Crow said. He turned his horse. "You are a hired drifter. Son, you forgot who runs this valley." He looked at the marshal. "Marshal, write it up." The marshal stepped off the boardwalk, his face the color of old paper. He looked at Thomas's body, then at Eli. His eyes were pleading. "Please," he seemed to say. "Do not make me do anything. Resisting arrest," the marshal stammered, his voice loud enough for the witnesses to hear. "Thomas Walsh he was resisting arrest. It was self-defense." One of Crow's men laughed again. "Self-defense. That is a good one. Marshal." They turned their horses and rode slowly down the street, passing Eli. Vance looked Eli in the eye and winked. "See you around, Cowboy." Eli stood there, impotent, the rifle heavy and useless in his hands. He watched them ride away. He heard their laughter fading into the distance, mixing with Clara's sobs. The town was silent. People began to turn away from their windows, closing curtains, shutting doors. They did not want to see. If they did not see, they did not have to act. Eli holstered his pistol and walked over to Clara. The sound of his boots was the only thing breaking the silence of her grief. He knelt beside her. "Clara," he said softly. Clara did not look up. She was rocking, whispering to her father. "You are okay. Papa, you are okay. We are going home." Eli reached out and touched her shoulder. "Clara, he is gone." Clara stopped rocking. She raised her head. Her face was a mask of tragedy. Her eyes were red and swollen, her cheeks smeared with blood and dust. She looked at the retreating figures of Crow's men. She looked at the closed doors of the town. They laughed. She whispered. Her voice was brittle, like dry grass snapping. "Eli, they laughed." "I know," Eli said. His throat felt like it was filled with glass. "Help me," she said. Eli stood up. He glared at the marshal, who was slinking back into his office. He glared at the empty street. He bent down and slid his arms under Thomas's body. He lifted the old man. He was light, so terribly light. Thomas's head lolled back, his dead eyes staring upside down at the town that had betrayed him. Eli carried him to the wagon that sat near the livery. He laid Thomas gently in the bed of the wagon. Clara climbed up beside him, taking her father's cold hand in hers. Eli climbed onto the seat and took the reins. He did not look at anyone. He snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. They rode out of town in silence. The only sound was the creak of the wagon wheels and the wind, which was finally beginning to die down, leaving a silence that was even worse. Eli felt every bump in the road. He felt every beat of his own heart, which seemed to be pumping guilt instead of blood. He should have been faster. He should have stopped Thomas from going. He should have shot Vance the moment he saw the gun. He looked back at Clara. She was staring at nothing, her face hardening into something like stone. "I swear to you," Eli whispered to the air, his voice too low for her to hear. "I swear I will not let laughter be the last sound he heard." The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch. The sky was a bruised purple, streaked with veins of blood red where the sun bled out against the horizon. The landscape looked like a battlefield after the fighting was done, empty, exhausted, and scarred. They did not take Thomas into the house. It did not seem right. They drove the wagon to the hill behind the house, next to the wooden cross where Clara's mother lay. Eli got the shovels from the barn. He handed one to Clara. She took it without a word. The ground was hard, baked by the summer heat. It resisted the metal. Eli struck the earth, the shock vibrating up his arms. He dug with a savage intensity, tearing at the ground as if he could hurt it. Clara dug beside him. She was weaker, but she did not stop. Her hands, already raw, began to bleed. She did not seem to feel it. They dug for hours as the darkness settled around them. The coyotes began to sing in the distance, a high, yipping chorus that sounded mocking. When the hole was deep enough, Eli climbed out. He was drenched in sweat. He went to the wagon and lifted Thomas's body. He lowered him down into the darkness. Clara stood at the edge of the grave. She dropped a handful of dry dirt onto her father's chest. "Goodbye, Papa," she said. They filled the grave. It went faster than digging it. When the mound of fresh earth was piled high, Eli fashioned a crude cross from 2 pieces of scrap lumber and hammered it into the ground. They walked back to the house in the dark. Clara did not go inside. She collapsed onto the porch steps, her strength finally giving out. She sat there, staring at her hands, which were dark with dirt and dried blood. "I should have made him leave," she whispered. Her voice was hollow. I knew they would kill him. I should have packed the wagon and forced him to go." "No," Eli said. He sat down on the step below her. "You could not have made him leave. Clara, this was his land." "It is my fault," she said, tears finally spilling over again. "I let him go alone." "It is not your fault," Eli said sharply. He turned to face her. "It is mine." Clara looked at him. "I let him go," Eli said. "I knew what they were. I knew what this town was. I should have tied him to a chair if I had to. I stayed behind because I was afraid." "Afraid?" Clara asked. "Afraid that if I went to town, I would become that man again," Eli said. "The man I told you about. I was trying so hard to be good. Clara, that I let a good man die." The confession hung in the air between them. The guilt was a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. It pushed them apart, each wrapped in their own failure, but it also bound them together. They were the only 2 people in the world who cared that Thomas Walsh was dead. Clara reached out and took Eli's hand. Her grip was weak, but her skin was warm. They laughed. She said again. It was the only thing her mind could hold on to. Eli looked at her. He saw the hatred burning in her eyes, drying up the tears. It was a cold, hard thing, that hate. It mirrored the feeling in his own chest. He stood up and walked into the yard. The wind was howling again, rattling the shutters. The coyotes were closer now, their cries sounding like the laughter of the men in the street. Eli looked toward the town. He could not see the lights from here, but he knew they were there. He knew Crow was sitting in a warm room, drinking whiskey, maybe retelling the story of how the old man fell. Something inside Eli hardened. It was like a door slamming shut. The part of him that had wanted peace, that had wanted to mend fences and break horses and live a quiet life, died in that moment. He rested his hand on the butt of his pistol. The metal was cold. If the law is part of the cruelty, he thought, then the law is no law at all. He looked up at the vast, indifferent stars. They think it is over, Eli whispered to the darkness. They think they can kill a man and laugh about it, and the wind will just blow it away. He turned back to look at Clara, who was watching him from the shadows of the porch. I promise you, Thomas, Eli said, his voice steady and lethal, and I promise you, Clara, I will make them remember a different sound than laughter. The silence in the house was louder than the wind that scraped against the siding. It was a thick, suffocating thing that filled the corners of the room where Thomas Walsh used to sit, the chair by the hearth that now held only the shape of his absence, in the days following the burial. Clara moved through the ranch like a woman made of smoke. She rose before the sun, her eyes gritty with a sleep that gave no rest, and she worked until her body simply refused to take another step. She scrubbed floors that were already clean until the wood turned white. She hauled water for the few remaining horses, the bucket bale digging into her palms until blisters formed and broke and bled, staining the leather handle dark. She did not wrap her hands. The pain was the only thing that felt real. She avoided the window that looked out onto the rise behind the house. She could not bring herself to look at the fresh mound of raw, red earth. To look at it was to acknowledge that he was down there in the cold dark, and not just in the barn fixing a bridle or out checking the south fence. The landscape seemed to conspire with her grief. The sky was a relentless, flat gray, pressing down on the valley like a heavy iron lid. Dust devils spun aimlessly across the dry pastures, pillars of grit that rose and fell without purpose, mimicking the turmoil in her own mind. There was a sense of waiting in the air, a tension that vibrated in the dry grass. It was as if the land itself knew that blood had been spilled and was waiting to see if more would follow. Eli Cade watched her from a distance, his heart twisting in his chest like a wet rag. He took on the work of 3 men. He was up while the stars were still bright, feeding the stock, mending the corral poles that had rotted through, and riding the perimeter of the reduced herd. He worked with a savage intensity, trying to sweat out the guilt that coated his insides like oil. He watched Clara when she did not know he was looking. He saw the way she would pause in the middle of the yard, staring at a coil of rope or a rusty nail, her face completely empty of expression. He saw the way her shoulders shook when she thought she was alone in the pantry. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to wrap his arms around her and hold her until the shaking stopped, to tell her that he was here, that he was alive, that she was not entirely alone in this vast, hostile emptiness. But he held back. He felt he had no right to touch her grief. He was the man who had arrived too late. He was the gunman who hadn't drawn his gun. Every time he looked at the pain etched into her face, he saw his own failure reflected back at him. At night, sleep was a stranger to him. He lay on the cot in the tack room of the barn, staring at the rough-hewn beams above. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back on the main street of Purgatory Creek. He heard the wind. He saw the dust swirling around the hooves of Crow's horses. He saw Thomas fall, the red bloom on his chest expanding with terrifying speed. And he heard the laughter. That was what kept him awake, the sound of men laughing while a good man choked on his own blood. It echoed in the barn, bouncing off the walls, louder than the coyotes yipping in the hills. It was a sound that scraped against his soul, raw and infectious. The town offered no comfort. It offered only the cold shoulder of indifference and the sharp edge of fear. 2 days after the funeral, Eli hitched the wagon and drove Clara into town for supplies. They needed flour and coffee, and Clara needed to face the people who had watched her father die. The main street was quiet as they rolled in. People on the boardwalk stopped their conversations and turned away, finding sudden interest in the display of a window or the dirt on their boots. No one tipped a hat. No one met Clara's eyes. They entered the general store, the bell above the door chiming with a cheerful sound that felt obscene in the heavy silence. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, was behind the counter, weighing a sack of beans. He was a man Thomas had known for 20 years. They had traded horses. They had shared whiskey at Christmas. Clara walked to the counter, her spine stiff. She placed her small list on the wood. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," she said. Her voice was thin, but steady. Henderson did not look up. He kept his eyes on the scale. "Morning, Clara. I need these things," she said, "and I will need to put them on the book until the end of the month. When we sell the calves—" Henderson stopped moving. He took a long, slow breath and finally looked at her. His eyes were not unkind, but they were filled with a terrified apology. "I cannot do that. Clara frowned. "Papa always had credit here. You know we are good for it." Henderson wiped his hands on his apron. "Things have changed. I cannot extend credit to the Walsh account anymore." Clara stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. "It is not about the money, is it?" Henderson glanced toward the front window, toward the street where Crow's riders often passed. "Clara, please, I have a family. I cannot afford trouble with Crow. He sent word. Anyone helping you?" "Well, he said he would take it personal." Clara felt a coldness spread through her limbs that had nothing to do with the winter draft. She looked at the man she had known since she was a child. "He was my father, Mr. Henderson. He was your friend. I am sorry. Clara, truly, but cash only." Clara looked at the list, then at her empty hands. She did not have the cash. The funeral had taken the last of the jar money. She turned and walked out of the store, leaving the list on the counter. Eli was waiting by the door. He had heard every word. He looked at Henderson with eyes that were flat and dead, and the storekeeper flinched, taking a step back. Eli followed Clara out to the wagon. She climbed up, sitting rigid on the hard wooden seat. She did not cry. She was past crying. She was learning the hard lesson of the West, that a poor ranch girl and a drifter had no value. They were dust under the boots of men like Silas Crow. The law, the commerce, the community. It all belonged to the highest bidder. The dam broke 3 days later. It was late afternoon, and the sky had turned a sickly shade of green, bruising toward purple in the south. The air was thick enough to chew. Clara was in the barn, trying to muck out the stalls. She was moving with that same frantic energy, pitching the heavy soiled straw with a fork that was too big for her. She was exhausted, her hair falling out of its pins, sweat plastering her dress to her back. She struck a patch of compacted earth and the fork jarred in her hands, sending a shock of pain up her arms. She tried to lift it, but it was stuck. She pulled, grunting with effort. She pulled again, harder, her boots slipping in the muck. It would not move. With a scream of pure frustration, she let go of the handle. She grabbed a metal bucket sitting nearby and hurled it with all her strength against the wall. It hit the timber with a deafening crash, denting the metal and scaring the horses in the corral. "Damn this place!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Damn this hard, dry, hateful land!" Eli was in the doorway instantly, a hammer in his hand. He dropped it when he saw her. Clara turned, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. She saw him standing there, solid and silent, and the sight of him suddenly became unbearable. "Why are you just standing there?" she shouted at him. "Do something! Fix something!" "Clara," Eli said softly, taking a step forward. "Do not come near me!" she yelled, backing away until she hit the stall door. "Where were you? Where were you when they killed him? You are supposed to be a gunman. You are supposed to be dangerous." The words hit Eli like physical blows. He did not flinch. He stood his ground, letting her pour the poison out. "You let him go alone," she sobbed. the anger beginning to crumble into despair. "You let him ride into that town and you let them kill him like a dog in the street." "I did," Eli said. His voice was rough. "I did. Why didn't you save him?" she wailed, sliding down the stall door until she was sitting in the straw, her face buried in her hands. "Why am I all alone?" Eli crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He knelt in the straw and reached for her. She flinched at first, striking out at his chest with her fists. Weak, ineffectual blows that carried all her heartbreak. "I hate you," she gasped, hitting his shoulder. "I hate you. I know," Eli whispered. "I know." He pulled her into him. Her resistance broke all at once, and she collapsed against his chest, her fingers curling into his shirt. Gripping him as if he were the edge of a cliff, she sobbed. "Great," heaving sounds that tore at her throat. Eli held her tightly. He buried his face in her hair, smelling the dust and the sweat and the scent of rain that was coming. His own eyes burned, hot tears tracking through the dust on his cheeks. He rocked her gently, absorbing her grief, taking the weight of it onto his own shoulders. For a long time, the only sound in the barn was her weeping and the wind rising outside. They were not rancher and hand, nor man and woman. They were 2 broken things, cracked and jagged, fitting together in the darkness because there was nowhere else to go. That night, the storm finally broke. It hit with the fury of a biblical plague. Thunder shook the very foundations of the small house, rattling the dishes in the cupboard. Rain lashed against the roof like handfuls of gravel thrown by a giant hand. Clara lay in her bed, staring into the dark. Every time the thunder cracked, she heard the gunshot. Every time the wind howled, she heard her father's rattling breath. The silence of the house was gone, replaced by the roar of the storm. But the loneliness was worse. She could not stay in that room. She rose, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and walked into the kitchen. A lantern was burning low on the table. Eli was sitting there. He had not gone to the barn. He was staring at his hands, turning them over and over in the yellow light, examining the calluses and the scars as if they belonged to a stranger. He looked up when she entered. His face was shadowed, the hollows under his eyes deep and dark. "I could not sleep," she said. "Neither could I," he answered. She pulled a chair out and sat across from him. The rain hammered against the window pane, a chaotic rhythm. "Is there any place, Eli?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Is there any place in this world where men like Crow do not win, where they do not just take what they want and laugh about it?" Eli looked at the flame of the lantern. He was silent for a long time. "I have not found it yet." "Clara," he said heavily, "I have ridden from the Rio Grande to the Dakotas. It seems the world is mostly made of men who take and men who get taken from." Clara pulled her shawl tighter. "But you are different. You know how to fight. You carry that gun like it is part of you." Eli laughed. A short, bitter sound. Knowing how to use a gun does not make a man good. "Clara, sometimes it just makes him efficient at being bad." He looked her in the eye then. The shadows on his face seemed to shift. "I told you I rode with a bad outfit, but I did not tell you everything." Clara waited, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "It was down in the San Juan Mountains," Eli said. "We called ourselves regulators, but we were just thieves. We rode for a man named Kincaid. He had a lot of pretty words about liberty." Eli's hand went to his jaw, tracing the white line of the scar. "We raided a settlement. It was supposed to be a cattle drive we were intercepting. But Kincaid, he wanted to send a message. He ordered us to burn the wagons. There were women inside, children." Clara stopped breathing. "I stood there," Eli whispered. "For a whole minute, I just stood there and watched the fire catch. I was so afraid of Kincaid, so afraid of not belonging, that I almost let it happen." "Almost?" Clara asked. "I shot Kincaid," Eli said. "I put a bullet in his shoulder and I dragged a woman and her boy out of a wagon before the roof collapsed. Kincaid's brother cut me with a Bowie knife. That is where I got this." He dropped his hand to the table. "I rode out that night. The woman and the boy lived, I think, But 2 others died in the fire before I moved. 2 innocent people died because I hesitated, because I was trying to decide if I was a wolf or a sheepdog. He looked at Clara, expecting to see the same rejection he had seen in the townspeople's eyes. I have been running ever since. Clara, running from Kincaid's men. Sure, but mostly running from the fact that for a minute, I was one of them. I had that same darkness in me. Clara looked at him. She saw the pain in his eyes, the deep, ancient regret that had carved lines into his face. But she did not see a monster. She saw a man who had looked into the abyss and pulled himself back, scarred but human. She realized then that his gentleness with the horses, his quiet patience with her father, his restraint in the town, it wasn't weakness. It was a fortress he had built to keep the darkness in check. "You are not running anymore," Clara said softly. "You are here." Eli shook his head. "And look what happened. I hesitated again. And Thomas is dead." Clara reached across the table. Her hand trembled, but she did not pull back. She touched his face. Her fingers traced the rough stubble of his cheek, moving up to the jagged white line of the scar along his jaw. It was an intimate gesture, shocking in its tenderness. Eli froze, his breath catching in his throat. "You stayed," Clara whispered. "You could have ridden on. You could have left us weeks ago, but you stayed. That is not the act of a coward." "Eli." She leaned closer. The air between them suddenly felt charged, heavy with the storm outside and the storm inside. "Will you run now?" she asked, tears spilling from her eyes again. "Will you leave me here alone in this hell?" Eli looked at her. He saw the hunger in her eyes, a desperation that matched his own. He realized in that second that leaving her would be the only true act of cowardice he had left to commit. If he rode away now, he would be killing the only part of himself that was worth saving. "No," he said. "I am not going anywhere." Clara let out a small, broken sound. She leaned forward, drawn by a gravity she could not resist. Their eyes locked. There was grief there. Yes, but beneath it was a fierce, living need. They were survivors on a raft in a drowning ocean. She moved her hand to the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair. Eli raised his hand and covered hers on the table, his grip tight. When they kissed, it was not gentle. It was a collision. Clara pressed her mouth to his, tasting the salt of her own tears and the coffee on his breath. It was messy and desperate. It was an assertion of life in the face of death. Eli met her with a hunger that frightened him. He stood up, pulling her up with him, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her body against his. She felt hard and soft all at once. He felt the heat of her through the thin fabric of her nightdress. The kiss deepened. It was full of anger at the world, full of the grief that had hollowed them out, and full of a sudden, terrifying desire to fill that hollow with each other. Clara felt a fire ignite in her belly, scorching away the numbness. For the first time in days, she felt alive. She felt his heart hammering against her chest, a frantic drumbeat that matched her own. Eli's hand slid down her back, pressing her closer. He wanted to lose himself in her. He wanted to forget the gunshots and the laughter and the burning wagons. He wanted to drown in the scent of her skin. Clara's fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him down. She wanted him to erase the memory of the grave. She wanted to be consumed. But as his hand moved to the small of her back, pressing her hips against his, a flash of cold reality struck her. The grave on the hill was fresh. The dirt wasn't even settled. Clara pulled back, gasping for air. She pushed against his chest. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, I cannot, not yet." Eli let her go instantly. He stepped back, his chest heaving, his hands held up as if in surrender. He saw the fear in her eyes, the sudden shame warring with the desire. "I am sorry," he rasped. "I am sorry. Clara." Clara touched her lips, which felt swollen and bruised. She looked at him, her eyes wide and dark. She wanted him so much it hurt, but the guilt was a wall she could not climb over tonight. She turned and fled the room, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. Eli stood alone in the kitchen. The lantern flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He listened to the rain hammering the roof, feeling the ache in his body, a physical pain of wanting that mixed with the sharp sting of his conscience. The morning brought a sky that was washed clean, a brilliant, hard blue that hurt the eyes. The mud in the yard was thick and deep. Eli saddled the bay horse. He moved with a cold, mechanical precision. He checked the cinch. He checked the bridle. He did not go to the house to eat breakfast. He could not face Clara yet. The memory of the night before, the taste of her, the way she had pulled away, was too raw. He mounted and rode toward town. He did not ride with the frantic desperation of the day Thomas died. He rode at a walk, sitting tall in the saddle. He wore his gun belt, tied down at the thigh. He reached the edge of Purgatory Creek and stopped. He did not ride down the main street. He stayed on the rise near the livery stable, watching. Down the street, outside the saloon, 3 of Crow's men were lounging on the boardwalk. It was mid-morning, but they were already drinking. Eli recognized Vance. He was leaning against a post, laughing. Vance pantomimed a draw, his hand flashing to his hip. Then he clutched his chest and staggered backward, making a choking sound. The other men roared with laughter. One of them slapped his knee. "Just like a gutted fish," the man shouted. Eli felt a coldness settle over him that was absolute. It was not the hot rage of the funeral. It was something older, something made of ice and iron. His hand drifted to his pistol. He could ride down there. He could put a bullet in Vance's head before the man stopped laughing. He imagined it. The recoil, the smoke, the red mist. But then he saw the marshal walking down the street, tipping his hat to the men as he passed. He saw the townspeople walking by, heads down. If he killed them now, he would be just another gunman. Another killer in a town full of them. They would hang him, and Clara would be truly alone. He turned the horse away, fighting the urge to draw until his muscles cramped. He rode to the small white church at the edge of town. The paint was peeling, and the cross on the steeple was listing to the side. He tied the horse and walked inside. It was empty, smelling of dust and old hymnals. Father O'Malley was sweeping the altar. He was an old man, his cassock threadbare. He looked up as Eli entered. "You are the man who works for Walsh," the priest said. Eli stood in the aisle, his hat in his hand. "I am the man who watched him die," Eli said. The priest sighed and leaned on his broom. "I'm sorry, son. Thomas was a good man. I want to kill them." "Father," Eli said. The words fell like stones. "I want to ride down there and kill every man who laughed." The priest walked down the steps. "Vengeance is a fire. Son, it burns the arsonist just as hot as the victim. If you go down that road, you will lose your soul, and you will lose that girl. She needs a protector, not a murderer." Eli looked at the crucifix on the wall. The painted wood was chipped. They were laughing. "Father," Eli said softly. "Today, just now, they were acting it out in the street, laughing about how he choked." The priest's face fell. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some scripture about forgiveness, about turning the other cheek. But the words died in his throat. He looked at Eli's eyes and saw the pain there, and the terrible truth of the injustice. He closed his mouth and looked at the floor. "God help us," the priest whispered. "God help us all." He could not tell Eli to forgive. In the face of such cruelty, forgiveness felt like another kind of sin. Eli rode back to the ranch as the sun began to dip toward the western ridges. The clouds from the storm were breaking up, leaving streaks of orange and violet across the sky. He found Clara on the porch. She was shelling peas into a bowl, her hands moving rhythmically. She looked up as he rode in. Her face was pale, but she met his gaze steadily. The awkwardness of the night before was gone, replaced by a quiet tension. Eli dismounted and walked up the steps. He stood before her, blocking the last of the sun. "I went to town," he said. Clara's hand stilled. Did you do anything?" "No," Eli said. "Not yet." He sat down on the railing, looking out at the land that Thomas Walsh had died for. "I spoke to the preacher. He told me vengeance would cost me my soul." Clara looked at the bowl of peas. "And what do you think?" Eli looked at her. I think my soul is already a patchwork thing. Clara, I think if I do nothing, if I let them take this land and mock his memory, then I am siding with them. Silence is just a quiet way of agreeing. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I am done running. Clara, I am done trying to be a peaceful man in a war. He reached out and took her hand. It was stained with the green juice of the pea pods. I am going to fight them, not with blind rage, but I am going to break them. I am going to make sure they never laugh at a Walsh again. It is going to get ugly, and it is going to get dangerous. He squeezed her hand. If you want to leave, I will help you pack. I will get you to the train station in the city. You can start over. Clara looked at him. She thought of her father dying in the dust. She thought of the storekeeper turning his back. She thought of the well poisoned with rot. She stood up, the bowl of peas sliding from her lap to the floor. She did not look at the mess. She looked at Eli Cade, the drifter with the scarred face and the gun he tried not to use. I am not going anywhere, she said. Her voice was low, but it had a steel in it that he had not heard before. This is my home, Eli, and you are my partner. She stepped closer to him, ignoring the warning bells in her head, ignoring the ghost of her father. If you are going to war, Eli Cade, then so am I. Eli stood and looked down at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, matching the one in his own. All right, he said. Then we start tonight. The sun slipped below the horizon, plunging the valley into shadow. But on the porch of the Walsh ranch, two figures stood close together, plotting fire and justice under the first rising stars. The map was spread out on the rough pine table in the kitchen, weighted down by a coffee mug and a box of cartridges. It was not a paper map drawn by surveyors, but a sketch Eli had made on the back of a grain sack, the lines thick with charcoal. For 3 days, the Walsh ranch had ceased to be a home and had become a war room. The grief that had threatened to drown Clara had hardened into a cold, sharp purpose. She stood over the table, her finger tracing the jagged line of the dry creek bed that cut through the Badlands to the north. Crow moves his beef through this draw when he is taking them to the railhead. Clara said, her voice was steady, stripped of the tremor that had been there at the funeral. The walls are steep, shale and loose rock. If a rider goes up the west side, he is exposed. But the east side, there is a goat trail here, behind the scrub oak. Eli watched her. He saw the way her mind worked, practical and ruthless. She knew this land better than she knew the lines of her own hand. She knew where the water gathered after a storm, where the rattlers denned in the heat, and where a horse could break a leg in a hidden gopher hole. He will have flankers, Eli said. He pointed to the ridges overlooking the draw. Vance is not a fool. He will put men up high to watch the herd. Then we do not hit them when they are moving. Clara countered. We hit them when they are resting. Here! She jabbed her finger at a spot where the canyon widened into a box canyon with a natural spring. They bed down here on the second night. It is a bottleneck. If we spook the herd from the south, they have nowhere to go but up the scree or back through the camp. Eli looked at the map, then at her. His old instincts, buried under years of trying to be a peaceful man, were surfacing. He felt the familiar hum of adrenaline, the cold calculation of risk and reward. It was a language he had sworn to forget, but he spoke it fluently. We need supplies, Eli said. If we start this, we cannot stay at the house every night. They will come looking. We need a cache. There is a line shack up near the Devil's Anvil, Clara said. It has been abandoned for 10 years. The roof leaks, but it is dry enough, and you cannot see it from the valley floor. Then we ride tonight, Eli said. The landscape became their third partner. It was a harsh, unforgiving ally, but it was theirs. They rode out before the sun crested the horizon, moving through the gray pre-dawn light like ghosts. The air was cold enough to bite at exposed skin, and the horses breathed plumes of steam. They kept off the main trails, sticking to the rocky ground where hoofprints left no trace. Eli watched Clara ride. She sat a horse with a natural grace, her body moving in rhythm with the animal. She wore a heavy canvas coat that had belonged to her father, The sleeves rolled up, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. She did not look like the ranch girl who had struggled with the garden. She looked like part of the wild country. They reached the line shack by mid-morning. It was a pitiful structure. 3 walls of rotting timber and a stone chimney that was half collapsed, tucked into a fold of the granite hills. But it was hidden. They spent the morning stashing supplies: a crate of tinned beans, a sack of flour, blankets, and 2 boxes of ammunition. They worked in silence. The only sounds the wind whistling through the cracks in the wood and the thud of heavy boxes. Eli walked the perimeter, checking the sight lines. He found a spot behind a boulder where a man could lie with a rifle and see the approach for a mile. "If they find us here, we are cornered," Eli said, coming back to where Clara was watering the horses from a canteen. "They will not find us," Clara said, "not unless they learn to fly." She looked out over the valley. The town of Purgatory Creek was a smudge of brown in the distance. The Walsh Ranch was a tiny speck. Eli stood beside her. He felt the change in her. The softness was gone, replaced by a brittle strength. It worried him, even as he admired it. "You are sure about this, Clara?" he asked quietly. "Once we pull the trigger on this, there is no going back to just mending fences." Clara turned to him. Her eyes were dark, reflecting the vast emptiness of the sky. He laughed. "Eli." He watched my father choke on his own blood, and he smiled. "I am not interested in mending fences. I am interested in tearing his down." Eli nodded. He understood that kind of hate. He had carried it himself for a long time, but he also knew that it burned everything it touched. "We have to be smart," Eli said. "We are not just killing men, we are breaking his hold. We cut his money, we cut his fear, we make him look weak. Then teach me." Clara said, "Teach me how to break him." The war began not with gunshots, but with silence and whispers. But before they could strike, they had to endure the town. A week after they established the cache, they rode into Purgatory Creek. They needed nails and oil for the tack. It was a test, and they both knew it. The town felt different. The fear that had always been present had sharpened into something uglier. As they walked down the boardwalk, Eli felt the eyes on them. It was not just curiosity anymore. It was hostility. They entered the mercantile. The shopkeeper, a man named Mr. Gable, was wiping down the counter. He looked up as they entered, and his face went rigid. "We are closed," Gable said flatly. Eli looked at the open door, the sign in the window. "It is 2 o'clock on a Tuesday." "Gable, I said we are closed," Gable repeated. "At least to the likes of you." Clara stepped forward. Her chin was lifted, her face pale but composed. "My money is as good as anyone else's. Mr. Gable, my father spent 20 years buying a seed from you." "That was before," Gable said, his eyes darting to the street. "Look, Miss Walsh, I do not want any trouble. Silas Crow came by yesterday. He made it clear. Anyone helping that Walsh girl and her gun hand—" "Well, he said accidents happen. He called me a gun hand," Eli noted. "Not a man, just a tool. I have children. Clara," Gable pleaded, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I cannot sell to you. Please, just go." Clara stared at him. She saw a man who was not evil, just small and terrified. "Come on, Clara," Eli said, his hand touching her elbow lightly. "We will not spend money where it is not wanted." They walked out. Across the street, 2 women were walking with parasols. When they saw Clara, they crossed the muddy street, lifting their skirts to avoid the muck, just to avoid passing her on the boardwalk. They whispered behind their hands, casting glances that were a mixture of pity and judgment. "She is bringing ruin on us all," one woman murmured loud enough to be heard. "Keeping company with a killer. It is indecent." Clara stopped. She looked at the women. She wanted to scream at them. She wanted to ask them where their decency was when her father was bleeding in the dirt. But she said nothing. She lifted her chin higher, her back straight as a lodgepole pine. "Let them look," she said to Eli. "Let them judge. They watched him die and did nothing. Their opinion is worth less than the mud on my boots." Eli looked at her with a fierce pride. She was not bowing. She was hardening, like iron in a forge. The wind that night was a living thing. It battered the ranch house, driving dust through the cracks in the walls, making the lamps flicker. They took shelter in the barn to check the horses. The animals were skittish, spooked by the howling wind. After the work was done, neither Clara nor Eli wanted to go back to the empty, echoing house. They sat on a stack of hay bales near the back of the barn. Out of the draft, Eli had thrown a heavy wool blanket over their shoulders. The lantern hung from a hook nearby, casting a warm, golden circle of light that held the darkness at bay. It was cold, the kind of bone-deep chill that heralded the coming winter. They sat close, their bodies touching from shoulder to hip. It was practical warmth, at first. "My father used to bring me out here during storms," Clara said softly. Her voice was lost in the vastness of the barn, intimate and small. "When I was a little girl, I was terrified of the thunder. He would sit me on old Bessie, that was our lead mare back then, and tell me that the thunder was just the sound of God moving furniture." Eli smiled in the dim light. "Sounds like him." "He taught me to ride in this barn," Clara continued. "He said a woman on a horse is equal to any man on the ground. He never treated me like I was fragile. Even after Mama died," she looked at her hands, calloused and scarred from the wire. "I miss him. Eli, I miss him so much it feels like I cannot breathe." Eli shifted, turning slightly to look at her. The lantern light caught the unshed tears in her eyes, making them shine like dark glass. "I never had that," Eli confessed. His voice was rough, a contrast to the softness of the moment. "My father left when I was 4. My mother, she did the best she could, but she was tired. I left home at 14. I have been drifting ever since." He looked around the shadowy barn, at the stalls, the tack hanging on the walls. "I never had a place that felt like home. Not until I rode into this yard." Clara turned to him. Her face was inches from his. She searched his eyes, seeing the vulnerability he kept hidden behind the wall of his stoicism. "You have a home now?" she whispered. The air between them changed. It grew heavy, charged with something that was not grief and not war. It was life. It was the undeniable, magnetic pull of two people who had faced death and chosen to survive. Eli's hand moved, almost of its own accord. He covered her hand where it rested on her knee. She did not pull back. Instead, she turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. Her grip was strong, desperate. She looked up at him, her lips slightly parted. The wind howled outside, but in the circle of lantern light, everything went still. "Eli." She breathed. He leaned in. He gave her every chance to turn away, to push him back. But she leaned forward to meet him. Their lips met. This time, it was not the frantic, grief-stricken collision of the night in the kitchen. It was slower, deeper. It was a question and an answer all at once. Eli tasted the dust of the day and the sweetness of her breath. He felt the softness of her lips and the desperate strength in her fingers as they tightened on his hand. He shifted, turning his body toward her. His other hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. Her skin was warm, so incredibly warm against the cold air. Clara made a small sound in her throat, a whimper of need. She released his hand and slid her fingers into the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming urgent. It was a hunger born of the realization that tomorrow was not promised. They were standing on the edge of a precipice, and the only thing keeping them from falling was each other. Eli's hand moved down to her waist, pulling her until she was nearly in his lap. He felt the curve of her body, the beat of her heart against his chest. The world shrank down to this, the smell of hay, the golden light, the heat of her mouth. It was reckless, it was dangerous, and it was the most beautiful thing Eli had ever known. Clara felt a fire spreading through her veins, chasing away the cold and the fear. She wanted to be closer. She wanted to erase the space between them. She tugged at his shirt, her hands seeking the warmth of his skin. Eli's lips trailed from her mouth to her jaw, then to the sensitive cord of her neck. Clara arched back, a gasp escaping her lips. For a moment, they were not soldiers in a losing war. They were just a man and a woman, alive and burning. Then, the sound cut through the wind. Hoofbeats. It was faint at first, then louder. The rhythmic pounding of shod hooves on the hard-packed road that ran past the ranch. They sprang apart as if burned. Eli's hand went instantly to the colt at his hip. Clara scrambled back, straightening her dress, her chest heaving. He blew out the lantern. Darkness swallowed them. They sat in the pitch black, listening. The riders did not turn into the lane. They continued on the main road, their voices carrying on the wind. Rough laughter. The jingle of spurs. Crow's men. They sat frozen until the sound faded into the distance. The spell was broken. The reality of their world, the violence, the threat, the enemy, came rushing back in. But in the darkness, the heat remained. Eli could still feel the imprint of her body against his. Clara could still taste him on her lips. They did not speak. They did not need to. The line had been crossed, and though they had stepped back, the memory of it lingered in the blood, hot and undeniable. 2 nights later, the sky over the Badlands turned orange. Eli and Clara lay on their stomachs on a ridge overlooking the Box Canyon. Below them, in the dark, Crow's herd was bedded down. 500 head of cattle, black shapes in the gloom. 2 guards were posted by the cook fire, drinking coffee. They were relaxed, confident. They did not think anyone would dare touch Silas Crow's property. They were wrong. Eli checked his rifle. "Ready?" he whispered. Clara nodded. She had a burlap sack soaked in coal oil in her hand. She was trembling, not with fear, but with adrenaline. "Do it," Eli said. Clara struck a match. The flame flared bright and sudden. She touched it to the sack, then stood up and threw it over the edge of the cliff. The burning sack tumbled down through the dark. A falling star of fire. It landed in the dry brush right next to the herd. At the same instant, Eli fired 3 shots in rapid succession, not at the men, but at the rocks just behind the cattle. The crack of the rifle shots echoed like thunder in the canyon. The burning brush flared up, spooking the nearest steers. Panic is contagious. In seconds, the herd was moving. The cattle scrambled away from the fire and the noise, pushing into each other. A tide of black muscle and horns. The guards shouted, running for their horses. But it was too late. The herd was stampeding. They surged toward the narrow neck of the canyon. Eli and Clara mounted their horses and rode along the ridge, firing into the air, driving the panic deeper. The cattle poured through the gap, scattering into the maze of ravines and gullies beyond. They would be lost for days. Some would break legs in the dark. Crow would lose weeks of time and thousands of dollars trying to gather them. From the ridge, Eli looked back. He saw the fire spreading in the brush, painting the canyon walls in flickering shades of red and orange. It looked like hell. It looked like justice. They rode hard for the line shack, their hearts pounding. When they finally stopped, miles away, they looked at each other in the moonlight. Their faces were smeared with soot and sweat. They did not smile. This was not a game, but there was a grim satisfaction in their eyes. They had drawn blood. Silas Crow did not take the insult lying down. The town of Purgatory Creek felt the tightening of his grip immediately. The marshal, sweating and nervous, went door to door. He asked questions about Eli Cade. He asked if anyone had seen Clara Walsh riding at night. He hinted darkly that people who knew things and did not speak might find themselves on the wrong side of the law. The townsfolk, terrified, clamped their mouths shut. They had seen the smoke from the fires. They knew a war had started, and they wanted no part of it. But Eli knew that fear was a double-edged blade. It kept people quiet, but it also made them resentful. The confrontation happened 3 days after the stampede. Eli had ridden into town alone to check the post, a pretense to gauge the mood. He stepped out of the post office and found his path blocked. Silas Crow stood in the middle of the boardwalk. He was flanked by Vance and another man. Crow looked immaculate in a gray suit, but his eyes were like flint. "Mr. Cade," Crow said. His voice was pleasant. which made it all the more menacing. "Crow," Eli acknowledged. He did not step off the boardwalk. He stood his ground, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Seems we have had some bad luck with the herd lately," Crow said. "Fires, spooked cattle. It is a dangerous time to be out at night." "Is it?" Eli asked. "I sleep soundly." Crow stepped closer. He smelled of bay rum and expensive tobacco. "You are playing a dangerous game. Drifter, you think because you have a fast hand you can bleed me? I have 50 men. You have, what, a grieving girl in a broken-down ranch?" He smiled, thin and cruel. "She is a pretty thing. Clara. It would be a shame if she got caught in the crossfire. Accidents happen. Eli, barns burn, people disappear in the Badlands." Eli's hand hovered inches from his pistol. His eyes locked on Crow's. The tension on the street crackled like heat on iron. The air seemed to vibrate. Vance's hand was on his gun. Crow saw the look in Eli's eyes. He saw the lethal intent. For a second, the cattle baron felt a flicker of genuine fear. This was not a man who bluffed. But Eli did not draw. To draw now was suicide. "You touch her," Eli said, his voice a low rumble, "and there will not be a hole deep enough to hide you." Crow laughed, but it was forced. "Tough talk. We will see how tough you are when the roof comes down on your head." Crow brushed past him, his shoulders slamming into Eli's. Vance followed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto Eli's boot. Eli stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs, watching them go. He knew then that the time for skirmishes was over. The real war was coming. The cost of that war arrived the next morning. Clara saw the smoke first. It was rising from the south, near the creek bottom where the squatter shacks were. They rode out to find the charred remains of a small cabin. It belonged to the O'Connor family. John O'Connor had once worked for Crow but had been fired for a lame leg. He had a wife and 3 small children. The cabin was ash. The family was sitting in the dirt, huddled together, wrapped in blankets salvaged from the fire. Clara dismounted and ran to Mrs. O'Connor. "What happened?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. The woman looked up, her face streaked with soot and tears. "They came in the night. Men with masks. They said John had been talking. They said he told you where the herd was." "He didn't," John O'Connor rasped, clutching his burnt arm. "I haven't spoken to you in months. Miss Clara, I swear." "We know. John, we know," Eli said grimly. "They burned us out." The woman sobbed. "We have nothing. Winter is coming and we have nothing." Clara stood up. She looked at the blackened ruins. She looked at the crying children. This was her fault. They had struck at Crow, and Crow had struck back at the weakest people he could find just to send a message. She felt a wave of nausea. "We will help you," Clara said. "You can come to the ranch. We have the bunkhouse." "No, Mrs. O'Connor shouted, pulling her children back. "We are not going near that place. He will kill us all if we go there. Just leave us alone." Clara stepped back as if slapped. She looked at Eli. His face was hard, his jaw set. They left the family some food and money, but they rode away in silence. Back at the ranch, the silence broke. "We did this," Clara said, pacing the kitchen floor. Her voice rose to a shout. "We did this. Eli, those children are homeless because of us. It is war." "Clara," Eli said quietly. "Innocents get hurt. I did not sign up for that," she screamed. "I wanted to hurt Crow, not John O'Connor." "We have to stop. We have to be more careful." "We cannot stop," Eli said. "If we stop now, he wins. He burns us out next. Then maybe we should let him. Maybe it is not worth it." She was hysterical, the guilt overwhelming her. She grabbed a plate from the table and threw it. It shattered against the wall. Eli grabbed her arms. "Clara, stop it! Let me go!" she sobbed, struggling against him. "I do not want to lose you. Do you hear me? I do not want to lose you like I lost Papa. I cannot take any more death." She collapsed against him, her fight draining away. Eli held her, pressing his forehead against hers. He felt her shaking. He felt his own heart breaking for her. "Listen to me," he whispered. "I am not going to die, and I am not going to let you die. We will fight smart. We will not be reckless. He pulled back enough to look into her eyes. I am not throwing myself into bullets just to feel righteous. Clara, I have a reason to live now. Clara looked at him, her eyes searching his face. What reason? Eli took a breath. He had never said the words before. He wasn't sure he knew how. He said. Clara let out a small sob. She reached up and touched his face. I love you, she whispered. The words hung in the air, fragile and terrifying. I do not care what the town thinks. I do not care about the war. I love you. Eli closed his eyes. He felt unworthy of it. He was a man with blood on his hands, a drifter, a cause of trouble. I do not deserve you. Clara, he said hoarsely, but I want you. I want you more than I have ever wanted anything. He kissed her. It was not like the kiss in the barn. It was not fierce with heat. It was slow. It was gentle. It was a promise. They stood in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the threats of the future. But in that moment, they had created an anchor. This love was not a distraction from the revenge. It was the only thing that would keep the revenge from consuming them whole. It was the tether that would keep them human when the fire finally came. And they both knew, as the wind rattled the windows, that the fire was coming soon. The night was a deceiver. It was silent, unnervingly so. The kind of silence that usually preceded a coyote strike on a new calf. The wind, which had been a constant companion for weeks, had died down to a whisper, leaving the air still and cold. Above, the stars were hard. Bright points of ice punched through the velvet darkness of the sky. The land seemed to be holding its breath, muscles tensed, waiting for the blow to fall. Eli Cade did not sleep. He lay on his bedroll in the front room of the ranch house, his boots on, his Winchester rifle resting across his chest. He had spent the last 2 days reinforcing the doors and setting tripwires made of dark twine around the perimeter of the yard, attached to tin cans filled with pebbles. He knew Silas Crow. He knew that a man like Crow did not suffer humiliation lightly. The stampede and the burnt supplies had hurt Crow's pride as much as his wallet, and pride was the only thing men like that valued more than gold. Clara was in her room, but she was not asleep either. She lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the settling groans of the old house. Her hearing, sharpened by weeks of anxiety, was tuned to the frequency of the night. It was not a tripwire that alerted her. It was something fainter. It was the soft, rhythmic chink of metal on metal, a bit chain clinking against a bridle, muffled by distance but distinct in the heavy silence. Clara slipped out of bed, her bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. She moved to the door of the front room and whispered, sharp and urgent, Eli. Eli was sitting up before her second syllable hung in the air. I heard it, he said, his voice a low rumble. No, Clara whispered. Not the wind. Tack, to the south. Eli moved to the window, peering through the crack in the shutters. The yard was bathed in starlight, shadows stretching long and black from the barn and the corral. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a shadow detached itself from the line of cottonwoods down by the dry creek bed. Then another. They are coming on foot, Eli said, his tone devoid of fear, replaced by a cold calculation. They left the horses back so we would not hear the hooves. Wake up, Clara. Put your boots on. Stay low. Clara was already moving. She pulled on her boots and grabbed the shotgun her father had kept behind the wardrobe. Her hands were steady. The fear was there, beating against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her hands were steady. Eli slipped out the back door, moving like smoke. He circled the house, crouching behind the water trough. He counted the shadows. 6, maybe 8. They were spreading out, moving with the confidence of men who thought their prey was asleep. One of the shadows moved toward the barn, carrying something that sloshed, coal oil. Eli leveled his rifle. He did not shout a warning. There was no law here tonight, only survival. He squeezed the trigger. The gunshot cracked the silence like a whip. The man with the oil can spun around, clutching his thigh, and fell screaming. The oil can hit the ground, spilling its contents into the dry dirt. The night erupted. Muzzle flashes bloomed in the dark like angry fireflies. Bullets thudded into the wood of the house and pinged off the metal rim of the water trough. Eli worked the lever of his Winchester, firing, racking, firing again. He aimed for the flashes, sending rounds into the darkness to keep them pinned. From the kitchen window, the boom of Clara's shotgun joined the chorus. She fired both barrels at a shape trying to rush the porch. The man yelled and dove for cover behind the woodpile. "Burn it!" a voice roared from the dark. It was Vance, Crow's lieutenant. "Burn it all to hell!" A torch flared to life, thrown by a rider who had circled around the back. It arced through the air and landed not on the house, but on a stack of winter hay piled against the side of the barn. The dry grass caught instantly. The flames leaped up, hungry and bright, illuminating the yard in a harsh, flickering orange light. The element of surprise was gone. The yard became a chaotic arena of shouting men, panicked horses screaming in the corral, and the crack of gunfire. Eli moved from the trough to the cover of the wagon. He saw two men rushing the front door. He dropped one with a shot to the chest. The other scrambled back into the dark. "Clara!" Eli shouted over the roar of the fire. "Get out of the house! The roof will catch!" He did not hear an answer. Inside, the back door crashed open. Vance kicked it in, splintering the wood. He was a big man, his face twisted in a snarl of rage. Clara spun around, trying to reload the shotgun, but her fingers fumbled with the shells. Vance was on her in 2 strides. He backhanded her across the face, the force of the blow sending her crashing into the kitchen table. The shotgun slid across the floor. "You little witch!" Vance spat. He grabbed her by the hair, hauling her up. Clara clawed at his face, her nails raking down his cheek, drawing blood. Vance grunted but did not let go. He wrapped an arm around her waist, lifting her off her feet, and dragged her toward the door. "Eli!" Clara screamed. It was a sound of pure terror that cut through the noise of the gunfight. Eli heard it. He abandoned his cover, sprinting across the open yard toward the house. A bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing the fabric of his shirt and stinging like a hornet. But he did not slow down. He reached the porch just as Vance dragged Clara out the back door. 2 of Crow's men stepped out from the shadows to block Eli's path. They were hired guns, hard men with cruel eyes. Eli did not stop. He did not hesitate. He swung the rifle barrel into the first man's jaw with a sickening crunch of bone, then dropped the weapon and drew his Colt. He fired point blank into the second man's stomach. He vaulted the railing, landing in the dust. He looked up just in time to see Vance heaving Clara onto the back of a waiting horse. Clara was kicking and fighting, her face pale in the firelight, her eyes locked on Eli. "Eli!" Vance swung up behind her. He spurred the horse hard. "Hold them off!" Vance shouted to the remaining men. "Finish it!" The horse bolted into the darkness, carrying the one thing in the world that tethered Eli to his humanity. Eli took a step to follow, his gun raised, but 3 men opened fire from the barn. Bullets kicked up dirt around his boots. He was forced to dive behind the stone lip of the well. He watched the darkness swallow Clara. He saw the terror on her face vanish into the night. Something inside Eli Cade broke, or perhaps something was repaired. The cold, efficient machine that he had spent 10 years trying to dismantle. He looked at the burning barn. He looked at the men firing at him. He stood up. He did not run for cover. He walked forward. The fire behind him painted his silhouette against the sky. A demon rising from the pit. He fired with a mechanical precision. 1 shot. 1 man fell by the barn door. He kept walking. A bullet tugged at his hat. He did not flinch. 2 shots. The man by the woodpile dropped his gun and crumpled. The last man, seeing his companions fall, seeing this figure walking through the fire and the lead, lost his nerve. He turned to run toward his horse. Eli stopped. He leveled the pistol, took a breath, and fired. The man fell face down in the dirt, 50 yards away. Silence rushed back into the yard, heavier than before, broken only by the roar of the consuming fire. Eli stood amidst the bodies and the embers. His chest heaved, the scent of charred wood, blood, and gunpowder was thick in his throat. It was the smell of his past, and now, the smell of his future. He turned to look at the house. The flames had jumped from the barn to the porch. The home that Thomas Walsh had built, the home Clara had fought for, was beginning to burn. Eli realized then exactly what Silas Crow had done. Crow thought that by taking Clara and burning the ranch, he would break Eli's spirit. He thought Eli would run or collapse in despair. But Crow was wrong. He had not broken Eli. He had clarified him. Crow had taken the only person Eli could not lose. He had stripped away the dream of a peaceful life. He had removed the need for caution. Eli holstered his hot gun. He walked to the corral. The horses were panicked, milling in the far corner. He caught the big bay, murmuring to it until it stood still. He saddled it with efficient, steady hands. He swung into the saddle and turned the horse toward the ridge that loomed above the town. If I do not go now, Eli thought, the clarity of it cold as a knife, she will be dead by morning. Or worse. He looked at the burning ranch one last time. Let it burn, he thought. We will build it again, or we will die trying. He spurred the horse into a gallop, riding straight into the teeth of the night. The ridge where Silas Crow had built his empire was a fortress of stone and timber, perched on a promontory that overlooked the entire valley. It was land stolen from the Arapaho and then stolen again from Mexican homesteaders. It was a monument to power. The trail up was treacherous, a series of narrow switchbacks cut into the living rock. With a sheer drop of 300 feet on one side, loose shale made the footing slick. Eli rode with a calm fury. He did not slow down for the turns. The bay horse, sensing the rider's intent, picked its way up the trail with straining muscles. Above, the sky was changing. The stars were being swallowed by heavy, bruising clouds rolling in from the west. Lightning flickered in the distance, silent and jagged, promising a storm that would drown the fires below. Eli watched the lightning. It felt like the earth was answering his rage. Inside the main house on the ridge, Clara was thrown into a heavy wooden chair in the center of the study. Vance tied her wrists behind her back with rough hemp rope, pulling it tight enough to cut off the circulation. "Leave us," a voice said from the shadows. Vance nodded and left the room, closing the heavy oak door. Silas Crow stepped into the light of the fireplace. He was holding a crystal glass of brandy. He looked unruffled, as if he were entertaining a guest rather than holding a hostage. He walked in a slow circle around her, like a wolf inspecting a trapped rabbit. "You have your father's eyes," Crow said softly, "and his stubbornness. It is a fatal flaw. Clara sat straight. She did not cower. She did not cry. She looked at him with a loathing so pure it felt like a weapon. "Where is he?" she asked. Her voice was raspy from the smoke. "Your drifter?" Crow chuckled. He took a sip of his brandy. "Dead, I imagine. Or running. Men like that always run when the fire gets too hot. He was a hired gun. Clara, he never cared about you." "You are a liar," Clara said. Crow stopped in front of her. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could smell the alcohol and the expensive cologne. "Am I? Look at you, tied to a chair in my house. Your ranch is burning. Your father is rotting in the ground. And where is your hero?" He set the glass down on a desk. "I'm going to keep you here, Clara, for a while. And if Mr. Cade is foolish enough to come, well, I want him to see you. I want him to see that everything he tried to protect belongs to me now." He reached out and touched a lock of hair that had fallen across her forehead. Clara jerked her head back. "Do not touch me." Crow smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips. "You still think you have a choice? You poor, stupid girl. You think because you mended a few fences you could stand up to me? I own this valley. I own the water. I own the law. You own nothing but fear." Clara spat. "You are a coward. Silas, you hide behind bought men and a bought badge. You never fought a fair fight in your life. That is why you had to kill my father in the street with 5 men backing you up, because you were afraid of an old man with a limp." Crow's face hardened. The amusement vanished. He straightened up and backhanded her, hard. Clara's head snapped to the side, her lips split, blood welling up. She tasted the copper tang of it. She turned her head back and looked him in the eye. She spat the blood onto his polished boot. Crow looked at the boot, then at her. His eyes were cold voids. "We will see how much fight you have left by morning," he whispered. Down in the town of Purgatory Creek, the lights were coming on. Word had spread like wildfire. A rider had come in shouting about gunfire at the Walsh place. People stood on their porches, wrapped in shawls and coats. They looked north, toward the ranch, and saw the orange glow reflecting off the low clouds. They looked up at the ridge, where Crow's house sat like a brooding vulture. The old preacher stood on the steps of the church. He watched the lightning fork across the sky, illuminating the ridge. "It has begun," he murmured to the marshal, who stood nearby, wringing his hat in his hands. "What has begun?" the marshal asked, his voice shaking. "The reckoning," the preacher said. "You cannot sow wind for 10 years and expect not to reap the whirlwind." The marshal looked up at the ridge. He swallowed hard. I should go up there." "You should," the preacher said, "but you won't." The townspeople watched. They felt the change in the air. The fear that had kept them silent was shifting into something else, a terrible anticipation. They knew, in their gut, that the man who had ridden into town with the scar on his face was not dead. And they knew he was coming for Crow. The storm broke as Eli reached the perimeter of the compound. Rain began to fall in heavy, icy sheets, turning the dust of the trail into slick mud. He left the horse in a thicket of scrub oak and moved on foot. He was a shadow within shadows. The sentries were huddled under the eaves of the bunkhouse, trying to stay dry, complaining about the weather. They were looking out toward the trail, not toward the shadows between the buildings. Eli moved like a phantom. He had no plan other than destruction. He needed a distraction. He found the hay barn, a massive structure filled with winter feed. He slipped inside, struck a match, and tossed it into a pile of loose straw. He did not wait to see it catch. He moved to the carriage house. He found a can of kerosene and doused the wall. Another match. He moved to the stables, opening the gates and slapping the rumps of Crow's prize thoroughbreds, sending them galloping out into the rain. Fire is a living thing, and in the wind of the storm, it grew with terrifying speed. The hay barn exploded into flames, a tower of orange that defied the rain. "Fire!" a sentry shouted. "Fire in the barn!" Men poured out of the bunkhouse, pulling on boots, grabbing buckets. Chaos took hold. In the confusion, Eli slipped toward the main house. He saw a man running past him, carrying a bucket. Eli stepped out of the shadows and pistol-whipped him. The man fell without a sound. Eli took the man's rifle and moved on. The flames were leaping high now, casting wild, dancing shadows across the yard. The rain hissed as it hit the fire, creating clouds of steam that mixed with the smoke. It was a vision of hell. Crow's men were running in every direction, unsure if they were under attack or just unlucky. Then Eli opened fire. He stood behind a stone retaining wall and began to pick off the men who were trying to organize a bucket brigade. He was not shooting to kill, not yet. He was shooting to terrify. He shot the buckets out of their hands. He shot the dirt at their feet. "Sniper!" someone screamed. "We are under attack." The men dropped the buckets and grabbed their guns. They began firing blindly into the dark, their shots sparking off the rocks. Eli moved. He never stayed in one place. He ran low, sliding in the mud, moving closer to the main house, inside the study. Crow heard the shouting. He heard the gunfire. He went to the window and looked out. His eyes widened. His empire was burning. He turned to Clara. "Is this him? Is this your cowboy?" Clara looked at the window, where the orange glow was pulsing against the glass. A fierce hope surged in her chest. "He is coming for you. Silas," she said. Crow drew a heavy revolver from a drawer in his desk. He checked the load. "Then I will kill him myself," Crow said, "and I will make you watch." He turned to leave the room. "Watch him," he ordered Vance, who had rushed back in. "If she moves, shoot her." Crow slammed the door. Vance stood by the door. his gun drawn. He looked nervous. The sound of the gunfire outside was getting closer. Clara looked at her bonds. The rope was wet with her own sweat and blood. She began to twist her wrists, ignoring the searing pain as the skin tore. She had to get loose. Vance was distracted, looking at the window. Clara pulled. She felt a slip. Her thumb joint dislocated with a sickening pop, but she bit her lip to keep from screaming. She pulled her hand through the loop. She was free. She did not wait. She scanned the room. On the small table next to her chair, there was a heavy brass letter opener. She waited until Vance looked out the window again, distracted by a particularly loud explosion of thunder. Clara lunged. She was fast, fueled by adrenaline and rage. She grabbed the letter opener and drove it into Vance's thigh. Vance screamed and dropped his gun, clutching his leg. Clara did not stop. She kicked him in the face with her boot, sending him crashing backward into the desk. He slumped to the floor, unconscious. Clara scrambled for the dropped pistol. She grabbed it, her hands shaking. She checked the hallway. It was empty. She ran. She ran through the smoky hallways of the big house. She heard boots pounding on the stairs. She ducked into a parlor as two men ran past. She had to find Eli. She burst out the front door onto the veranda. The main yard was a slaughterhouse of mud and fire. The rain was coming down in torrents now, washing the blood into the earth. Eli had reached the center of the yard. He had discarded the rifle and was holding his Colt. He was covered in mud, his hat gone, his hair plastered to his skull. He was surrounded by the wreckage of Crow's power. The barns were infernos. The wagons were overturned. Crow stepped out onto the porch of the bunkhouse, 20 yards away. He was soaked, his fine suit ruined. He held his revolver down at his side. "Cade!" Crow roared over the storm. Eli turned. The two men faced each other across the expanse of mud. Lightning flashed, freezing the scene in a stark, blue-white light. Crow stepped down into the mud. He walked toward Eli. "Look at you!" Crow shouted. "You look like a dog rolling in the dirt." Eli did not speak. He watched Crow's hands. "You think burning my barns changes anything?" Crow taunted. "I can rebuild barns. I can buy more cattle. But you are nothing. You are a tool that has outlived its usefulness." Eli stood still. He was the eye of the storm. "Where is she?" Eli asked. His voice was not a shout, but it carried through the rain. Crow stopped 10 paces away. He smiled. "She is inside, waiting for the winner. But men like you never win. Eli, you serve. Men like me own the land. We are the future. You are just a relic of a violent past." Eli raised his gun slowly. "I am not the past. Crow, I am the judgment." Crow's eyes narrowed. He was fast. He raised his gun. But he didn't fire at Eli. He looked past Eli, toward the burning house. Eli sensed the movement behind him too late. Another of Crow's men had come up from the cellar door, aiming a shotgun at Eli's back. Crow smiled. "Goodbye, Mr. Cade." Eli braced himself, knowing he couldn't turn fast enough. Then a scream tore from the veranda. "Eli!" Clara stood there. She saw the man with the shotgun. She saw Crow. She did not think. She did not calculate. She ran. She leaped off the veranda, hitting the mud, and tackled Crow from the side just as he was about to give the order to fire. The impact sent Crow sprawling into the muck. His gun discharged into the air. The distraction was all Eli needed. He spun, dropping to one knee, and fired at the man with the shotgun. The man fell backward into the cellar. Eli spun back around. Crow was scrambling to his feet, shoving Clara away. He raised his gun toward Eli, his face a mask of animal panic. Eli did not hesitate. He did not blink. He fired. The bullet hit Silas Crow in the center of his chest. Crow staggered back. He looked down at the hole in his shirt. He looked up at Eli, his mouth opening as if to speak, as if to order the bullet to leave. Disbelief washed over his face. He fell to his knees. Then he pitched forward, face down in the mud. The man who had laughed as Thomas Walsh died lay silent in the mire. There was no laughter now, only the sound of the rain. For a long moment, nothing moved. The storm roared overhead. The flames devoured the outbuildings, crackling and spitting in the rain. Eli stood over Crow's body, his gun still raised, smoke drifting from the barrel. Clara pushed herself up from the mud. She was shaking violently. Eli lowered the gun. He looked at her. Clara. He breathed. He holstered the weapon and ran to her. He grabbed her, pulling her up, wrapping his arms around her as if he were trying to weld her body to his. Clara clung to him. She buried her face in his wet shirt, sobbing and laughing at the same time. The relief was a physical pain. "I thought I lost you," Eli whispered into her hair. "I thought I lost you. I am here," she gasped. "I am here." He pulled back and looked at her face. He saw the bruise on her cheek, the cut on her lip. His eyes darkened. "He hurt you?" Clara shook her head. "He is dead. Eli, it is over." Eli looked down at Crow's body, then back at her. He cupped her face in his muddy hands. He kissed her. It was fierce and unrestrained. It was a kiss that tasted of rain, of smoke, of blood, and of life. It was two souls who had walked through the fire and come out the other side, scorched but whole. The mud splashed up their boots. The thunder rolled like applause. They stood in the wreckage of the tyrant's castle, holding on to each other with a desperation that defied the death around them. Down at the base of the ridge, the townspeople watched. They saw the fires begin to die down. They saw the lightning move east. The marshal took off his hat. The preacher bowed his head. And up on the ridge, in the pouring rain, a cowboy and a ranch girl held on to life with both hands, refusing to let go. The dawn did not break gently. It came as a bruise of purple and sullen gray on the eastern horizon, slowly bleeding into a pale, cold light that revealed the devastation of the night. The storm had passed, dragging its heavy skirts of rain and thunder toward the plains, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a ringing in the ears. On the ridge that overlooked Purgatory Creek, the air smelled of wet ash, scorched timber, and the copper tang of blood. The compound that Silas Crow had built as a monument to his own power was a smoking ruin. The barns were nothing but blackened skeletons of charred wood, jutting up from the mud like broken teeth. The main house, though still standing, was scarred by smoke and bullet holes, its windows shattered eyes staring blindly out at the valley. Eli Cade stood in the center of the yard. He was mud from his boots to his hair. His shirt was torn at the shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. The blood dried and dark against the fabric. He looked less like a man and more like a statue carved from the earth itself, worn down by wind and violence. Beside him stood Clara Walsh. She was shivering, not from cold, but from the adrenaline leaving her body. Her dress was ruined, hem heavy with muck, and her face was bruised where Vance had struck her. But she stood straight. She held Eli's hand, her fingers laced through his so tightly that her knuckles were white. Around them, a handful of surviving men, ranch hands who had worked for Crow not out of loyalty but out of fear, sat on the ground, nursing injuries, their weapons discarded in a pile near the well. They looked at Eli with wary, terrified eyes. They had seen him walk through fire. They had no fight left in them. From the trail below, the sound of voices drifted up. The town was coming. They appeared first as heads cresting the rise, then as figures struggling up the muddy, treacherous path. The marshal led them, his face the color of old parchment. Behind him came the preacher, Father O'Malley, holding his rosary, then the blacksmith, the storekeeper, Mr. Gable, and a crowd of others, men and women who had watched the flames from their porches and known that the world was changing. They stopped at the edge of the yard, staring at the destruction. They looked at the burned barns. They looked at the body of Silas Crow, lying face down in the mud where he had fallen, a puddle of water reflecting the gray sky next to his head. The marshal stepped forward. He looked at the body, then at Eli. His hand went to his gun belt, but he did not draw. He seemed unsure if he even had the authority to speak in the face of such carnage. "My God," the marshal whispered. "What have you done? Cade, I finished it," Eli said. His voice was a rasp, rough as sandpaper. The marshal looked around at the crowd, then back to Eli. He tried to straighten his spine, tried to summon the ghost of the authority he had bartered away years ago. You killed him, the marshal said. You and the girl, you burned his property. You killed his men. This is murder. Cade, I have to take you in. Eli looked at the marshal. He did not raise his hands. He did not reach for his gun. He simply stood there, exhausted. He expected this. He had known the moment he pulled the trigger that there was no riding away from this. He was a drifter who had killed a cattle baron. The law, however crooked, would demand a price. I am ready, Eli said quietly. He made a move to step forward, to offer his wrists for the irons, but Clara stepped in front of him. She moved with a speed that surprised them all, placing her small, battered body between Eli and the law. She faced the marshal, and she faced the townspeople huddled behind him. No, Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried in the damp air like a bell. Clara, step aside, the marshal warned. This man is a killer. This man saved me, Clara shouted, her voice cracking. And he saved all of you, though you are too blind to see it. She pointed a trembling finger at Crow's body. Look at him. Look at the man you let rule you. Do not pretend you do not know what he was. Do not pretend you did not know about the stolen land. Do not pretend you did not know about the poisoned wells and the burned shacks. The crowd shifted uneasily. Mr. Gable looked at his boots. He killed my father in the street, Clara continued, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. In broad daylight, and you watched. She scanned the faces of the townspeople, making eye contact with the women who had crossed the street to avoid her, with the men who had looked away when Thomas was beaten. You stood there and you watched, Clara screamed. And do you know what they did? They laughed. The word hung in the air. Laughed. They laughed while he choked on his own blood. Clara sobbed, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow louder than her scream. They laughed because they knew no one would stop them. They laughed because they knew the law was in their pocket and the town was on its knees. She reached back and grabbed Eli's hand again, pulling him slightly forward. Eli did not laugh. She said, Eli cried. And then he came here and he stopped the laughter. If you arrest him, you arrest me too. Because I helped him, I would help him do it again 1,000 times. Silence stretched across the ridge. The wind picked up, rustling the charred timbers of the barn. Then, Father O'Malley stepped forward. He walked past the marshal and stood beside Clara. He put a hand on her shoulder. She is right, the priest said. His voice was deep and weary. I stood in the church door and I watched the lightning strike this ridge. I prayed for justice, and I believe the Lord sent it, though it came in a form we did not expect. The priest looked at the marshal. Eli Cade did not start this violence. Marshal, he ended it. If you take him in, you are condemning the man who finally stood up when the rest of us were kneeling, one by one. The dam broke. A Mexican man, the father of the boy Crow had beaten months before, stepped out of the crowd. He took off his hat. Crow took my water, the man said. He told me if I complained, he would burn my house. This man, he stopped it. A widow, Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, nudged her husband. Tell him, she hissed. Gable looked up, his face red. He threatened my shop. Marshall said if I sold to the Walshes, he would see me ruined. He ruled by fear. We all know it. The voices grew. Stories of intimidation, of theft, of cruelty that had been swallowed for years finally poured out. The mask of respectability that Silas Crow had worn was shattered, lying in the mud alongside his body. The marshal looked at the crowd. He saw the shift. He saw that if he tried to arrest Eli Cade today, he would not just be arresting a drifter. He would be fighting his own conscience and the will of the town. He looked down at Crow. He looked at the gun lying in the mud near Crow's hand, the gun Crow had tried to use. The marshal took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He holstered his own pistol. He looked at Eli, his eyes hard but resigned. It appears, the marshal said, his voice loud enough for the record, that Silas Crow drew on you, and it appears you were defending this young woman from abduction." He paused, looking at the ruins. "Self-defense," the marshal declared, "and defense of another. No charges will be filed." A collective breath seemed to leave the crowd. "But hear me, Cade," the marshal added, pointing a finger. "This ends here. The killing stops today, or I will come for you, and I will not be alone." "It is done," Eli said. The prejudice did not vanish with the smoke. As the townspeople made their way back down the trail, some still cast wary glances at Eli. They whispered among themselves. He was still a killer. He was still a stranger with a scarred face and a gun that was too fast. Can a wolf really live among sheep? One woman whispered to her husband. "He is dangerous," the husband muttered back. Best to stay clear of the Walsh place, but others lingered. The Mexican family approached Clara and Eli. The father took Eli's hand and shook it, his grip firm. "Gracias," he said. "Mrs. O'Connor," the woman whose shack had been burned in retaliation, walked up to Clara. She did not speak, but she squeezed Clara's hand, her eyes wet with tears. Clara and Eli stood together until the last of them had gone. They were free, but they were also alone again, standing in the wreckage of the war. The ride back to the Walsh ranch was silent. The horses were tired, their heads hanging low. When they turned into the lane, the full extent of the damage hit them. In the dark and the chaos of the fight, they had not truly seen it. Now, in the harsh light of mid-morning, it was a gut punch. The barn was a pile of ash and black beams. The corrals were smashed. The house was a shell. The fire had gutted the kitchen and the front room before the rain had drowned it. The roof had collapsed in 2 places. Clara slid down from her horse. She walked to the porch steps, which were charred and precarious. She looked at the door hanging off its hinges. She sat down on the bottom step and put her face in her hands. "It is gone," she whispered. Eli dismounted and tied the horses to the only fence post that was still standing. He walked over to her. Clara looked up. Her eyes were hollow. Mama's table, Papa's chair, the drawings on the wall. "It is all gone. Eli?" She looked out at the fields, which were muddy and torn up by the hooves of the stampede and the gunfight. "Maybe we should leave," she said. Her voice was dull. "There is nothing here but ghosts now. We could go west or east, anywhere but here." Eli looked at the ruin. He saw the blackened wood. He saw the mud. But he also saw the land beneath it. The land Thomas Walsh had refused to sell. The land Clara had fought for with a shotgun and a heart full of fire. He sat down beside her, ignoring the soot that coated the step. "No," Eli said. Clara looked at him, surprised. "But there is no house. There is no barn." "We have hands," Eli said. He held his own hands out, palms up. They were scarred, dirty, and large. "We have wood in the high country. We have tools. Some of them. Anyway." He looked at her. "I have spent my whole life drifting. Clara, I walked away from every place I ever slept. I never looked back. I never thought I was allowed to." He picked up a piece of charred wood and crumbled it between his fingers. "I never thought I was allowed to dream of a home, of a family, of waking up and knowing that the coffee pot would be in the same place and the person across the table would be looking at me with love." He turned to her. "I want to stay. Clara, I want to build it back, better than it was. I want to put roots down so deep that no wind can ever blow us away. If you will let me." Clara stared at him. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the hope that was more terrifying to him than any gunfight. "You want to stay?" she asked. "Here? With the memories?" "Because of the memories," Eli said, "and because of the future." Clara looked at the burned house. She imagined it rebuilt. She imagined the smell of fresh pine instead of smoke. She imagined Eli walking through the door, not as a hired hand, but as her husband. She reached out and took his hand. "Okay," she whispered. "We stay." The work was brutal. It was harder than the fighting had ever been. Fighting was instinct. Building was an act of faith. They cleared the debris first. They hauled away the charred timber. staining their skin black with soot that took weeks to wash off. They salvaged what they could: the iron stove, the metal bed frame, the few tools that had survived the heat. They slept in the line shack for the first week, riding down every morning at dawn. Then, help arrived. It started with the Mexican family. The father and his 2 sons rode up one morning with a wagon full of cut lumber. They did not ask if they were wanted. They just started unloading. Then came Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper who had refused them credit. He brought a crate of nails and a sack of flour. He did not say much, just tipped his hat and muttered that he reckoned they might need supplies. It was his penance, and they accepted it. Even some of the men who had ridden for Crow, drifters who had no loyalty to the dead tyrant, came by. They were ashamed, looking at the ground, asking if there was work to be done. Eli put them to work digging post holes. He did not berate them. He just handed them shovels. Slowly, the ranch began to rise from the ashes. The frame of the new barn went up first, then the house. It was smaller than the old one, but it was sturdy. Eli built the walls thick to keep out the wind. In the evenings, when the light failed and the workers went home, Clara and Eli would sit by a campfire in the yard. They cooked simple meals, beans and cornbread made in a Dutch oven. They were too tired for passion most nights. They would eat in silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. But it was a comfortable silence. One night, 3 months after the fire, they sat by the fire. The shell of the house was finished, the roof shingled. Clara leaned her head on Eli's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling the blanket tight around them both. "We need to buy stock in the spring," Eli said, staring at the flames. "I know," Clara said. "We have enough for a small herd. If we sell the bay mare's foal—" "And I was thinking," Eli said slowly, "we should plant cottonwoods along the creek, for shade. In 20 years, they will be tall." 20 years, Clara repeated. It sounded like a promise. Eli looked down at her. Maybe in a few years, there will be children to play under them." Clara smiled. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar that seemed to have faded in the firelight. "Maybe," she said softly, "children who will run barefoot and never know the sound of gunfire." The night they moved into the new house, the air was cold and crisp. There was no furniture yet, just a mattress on the floor in the corner of the main room. They built a fire in the new stone hearth. The smell of cedar smoke and fresh sawdust filled the room. There were no gunshots in the distance, no riders on the ridge, just the soft chirp of crickets and the crackle of the fire. Eli barred the door, not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to shut the world out. He wanted to keep this peace, this woman, safe inside. He turned to Clara. She was standing by the fire, wearing a simple white nightdress. Her hair was loose, falling down her back in a dark wave. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark and shining. "Come here," she whispered. Eli went to her. He took her in his arms. But this time, there was no desperation. There was no frantic clutching, no fear that the moment would be stolen. He kissed her, and it was a slow, reverent thing. It was a claiming. They sank down onto the mattress. The intimacy that followed was slow and tender. His hands explored her not with the urgency of a man facing death, but with the wonder of a man who had been given a second life. He touched her scars, the ones on her hands, the bruise that had faded on her cheek, as if they were holy things. Clara held him. She felt the weight of his body, the strength in his arms, and she knew that the war was truly over. They had survived the fire, they had survived the blood, and now, in the quiet of their own home, they were healing each other. The next morning, the sun poured through the east window, painting the bare floorboards in squares of gold. Eli woke first. He lay still, listening to Clara's steady breathing beside him. He looked at her face, relaxed in sleep. The lines of grief smoothed away. He felt a fierce swelling in his chest. He was not Eli Cade, the drifter. He was Eli Cade, the rancher, the husband. Clara stirred and opened her eyes. She saw him watching her. She smiled, a slow, sleepy smile that reached her eyes. "Morning," she whispered. Morning, he said. There was no shame between them, no hesitation. They rose and dressed, moving around the new kitchen with a practiced rhythm. Boiling water, grinding coffee. They walked out onto the porch together. The valley was greening up. The grass was returning to the burned patches, fed by the winter rains. Time moved differently now. It was measured in seasons, not survival. New calves were born in the spring. Laughter, real laughter, not the cruel kind that had haunted them, began to float from the porch in the evenings. The ranch became known as the Walsh-Cade place, but among the drifters and the down-on-their-luck cowboys, it had another name. They called it the Sanctuary. Eli hired men no one else would touch. He hired the boy from the orphanage who had been caught stealing apples. He hired the widow O'Connor to cook, giving her and her children a cabin of their own. He never asked about a man's past. He only asked for an honest day's work. The town changed, too. Without the shadow of Silas Crow, the fear evaporated like mist. Storekeepers looked their customers in the eye. The marshal eventually retired, replaced by a younger man who respected the law more than the dollar. Prejudice did not vanish entirely. There were still those who whispered about Clara and her gunfighter husband. But every Sunday, when Eli and Clara rode into church, heads held high, the whispers grew quieter. Every act of fairness, every shared drink, every day lived without cruelty was a victory. In the final scene, years later, the sun was setting over the western ridge. The sky was a masterpiece of gold and crimson. Clouds streaked with violet. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of sage and blooming cactus. Clara and Eli stood on the high ground above the ranch, looking down. Below them, the white farmhouse glowed in the twilight. The cottonwoods they had planted were saplings now, their leaves fluttering like silver coins. Cattle grazed in the pasture, fat and sleek. Clara slipped her hand into Eli's. His hand was rougher than ever, scarred from work, but it was warm. He laced their fingers together and lifted her knuckles to his lips, kissing them gently. Papa would have grumbled about the fence line being crooked, Clara said softly, a smile playing on her lips. Eli chuckled, and then he would have smiled to see the herd. Clara nodded. The ache of losing Thomas was still there, a small, hard stone in her heart. But it no longer had sharp edges. It sat side by side with the joy she felt now. Do you ever think about it? Clara asked, looking at the distant trail where the Badlands began. The gunshots, the laughter. Eli looked out at the horizon. His eyes narrowed slightly, the old reflex of a watchman. Sometimes, he admitted. Sometimes in dreams, I hear it. I hear Vance laughing. I hear the thunder. He turned to look at her. His eyes softened, the shadows retreating. But then I wake up, and I see your face. I hear you breathing. And the ghosts, they just fade away. Clara leaned her head against his arm. We won, Eli. Eli looked down at the ranch they had built from ash and blood. He looked at the woman who had saved his soul. Yes, he said, we lived. They turned and began to walk back down the ridge, toward the lights of their home that were flickering on in the dusk. The path was steep, and the night would be cold. Life in the West would always be hard. The drought would come again, the winter would bite, and there would always be men who tried to take what wasn't theirs. But as they walked side by side, their shadows blending into one long shape on the grass, they were not afraid. Their love had been forged in tragedy and tempered by fire. It was a shield and a sword. In a world that had tried to break them, they had chosen each other. They had carved out a piece of justice that stood solid and true, a monument that no one, ever again, could laugh away. Thank you for listening to They Laughed as Her Father Died. The cowboy returned that night with fire and justice. I hope this story of Clara and Eli resonated with you. It is a tale about the cost of vengeance, the power of resilience, and finding a home in the unlikeliest of places. I would love to hear your thoughts. Where are you listening from today? Did you feel that justice was served? Please leave a comment below in English and share your favorite moment from the story. If you enjoyed this journey into the American West, Please make sure to subscribe to From Wild West. We have many more stories of grit, gunpowder, and glory to tell. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.